Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're here with another discussion video and I'm joined yet again with the Archivist.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Glad to be back.
So today we wanted to talk about all of the lightsaber forms, run through the lightsaber forms, talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, what defines them, the notable practitioners of them, and really create a comprehensive discussion about what each of the forms do, the benefits, how they stack up against other forms, how sort of the idea of why one form would defeat another one or one character, and how that doesn't necessarily translate to every duel in the lore. And hopefully by the end of this video, we will have made a comprehensive breakdown and deep dive into all 7 of the lightsaber forms, including a few of the variants of the forms, and then at the end, different applications of the lightsaber, such as Trakata. But before we get all the way till the end, let's go ahead and break down form number 1 and get right into it. Form number
Let's
1.
go.
Yep, form number 1, Shicho. It is known as the Determination form, the Way of the Sarlacc. It was developed by the ancient Jedi, which notably at the time wielded swords and not lightsabers. It was characterized by broad sweeping strokes, simple movements, so that those that were undertaking it would be able to become more acclimated to the weapon. It was made on simplicity. It's also had wide sweeping movements, the biggest, widest movements, most exaggerated movements of any of the lightsaber forms. It was meant for crowd control and disarmament, of course, the core principles of a Jedi. And what we'll come to understand over the course of breaking down each form is, along with the evolution of the lightsaber, we'll also get into the evolution of the Jedi and the Sith as well, and how each form sort of marks what the galaxy is presenting to the Force wielders at the time. So Form 1, this is the genesis of Force wielders. It's the genesis of lightsaber combat. Because of that, it taught them to take on multiple enemies at once. This form was developed in an era of pretty unprecedented peace. There was not saber-to-saber combat going on very frequently at all, which means that they were taught to be guardians. They were taught the basics, and it was meant to be simple. It was meant to be the backbone of all other forms, which I believe Kit Fisto has said before that all other lightsaber forms are sort of built off of Shicho, and that if you're going to master the other forms, you must first have a basic understanding of Form 1 lightsaber combat. So do you want to run through some of the greatest strengths and weaknesses?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Form 1 is super slept on, in my opinion, because it wasn't just Kit Fisto who says that, but that's something that's made pretty apparent in the Jedi Path, the sort of Jedi training manual that we're given. They talk about how Form 1 is that very foundational form. You're not going to be able to get any of the other styles until you, if not master, at least become very familiar with this first form. And as far as strengths go, again, the first and most important part about Form 1 is that it is reliable. Being the most foundational lightsaber form, you're not going to find any better fallback option than this one. And that was what it was meant to do. Obi-Wan actually got kind of irritated with Qui-Gon because Qui-Gon kept him in the basics of lightsaber combat and always in the basic sequences of Form 1 and in the lightsaber form that he was teaching him at the time, which was Ataru. But it was because of this that Obi-Wan had a solid foundation of becoming one of the finest lightsaber duelists of the Order, and it all starts here. And with that reliability comes the added benefit that any Jedi can learn this form. The Jedi Order, as we know, is made up of all different kinds of species, which is what makes it super unique, but not all species can use the different lightsaber forms, as we'll find out, because some species are spherical or have like tentacles or whatever, but Shicho was meant to be used by all kinds of people.
Yeah, someone like Oppo Rancisis would have a hard time probably with this. Or
Right.
or Yarel Poof, he might take his own head off. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry, man. I was about to say, like you said, it was strong against multiple opponents, and it was meant to be used against opponents who had multiple weapons. Back in these ancient days of the galaxy, blasters hadn't been invented yet, so everyone was still using metal melee weapons, and even when the Jedi transitioned into using the proto-sabers after they stopped using their metal swords, the galaxy was still using mostly melee weapons, so Shi-Cho with its broad strokes was supposed to be able to sweep the battlefield and cut the enemy's weapons right off at the hilt, so that it rendered them useless and created a peaceful resolution to the battle.
Yeah, and talking about peaceful resolutions, though, for me, Shi-Cho has always shared a unique relationship to Niman or Nyman, and that is that it is generally considered relatively weak against other lightsaber wielders. Shi-Cho is considered to be relatively weak by individuals like Dooku or Vader because it's just too simple. It doesn't have a lot going on. But why I say those two are so similar is the amount of individuals that have ever mastered Shi-Cho is exceptionally rare. It is one of the most difficult forms to master out of all of them, despite being the most simple form to get a grasp of. And that is why it's so fascinating. It's easy to learn. It is nearly impossible to master. And the reason...
Masterfully, yeah.
Yeah, the reason for that, and the reason why a lot of Padawans do not reach mastery of Shi-Cho is because one can find themselves getting whirled up in emotions. When someone adds emotion to Shi-Cho, when they add Kit Fisto sort of attacks with the idea that he wants to end the conflict as soon as possible. And to end a conflict as soon as possible, sometimes that requires a little bit of aggression and offensive output that would not be acceptable for most other Jedi. There was a training session where Obi-Wan was looking at Kit Fisto duel and becoming concerned that he was leaning too far into the way of the form, too far into the way of the Sarlacc, and becoming engulfed in emotion and determination to end the duel, that Obi-Wan questioned if he was dancing too far to aggression that could lead to the dark side.
Yeah, and it's because the motions of the lightsaber are so simple with Form 1 that it makes it very easy to chain it into random attacks. Because there is, it's just very straightforward strikes in each of the targeting zones. They can be chained into a random pattern that has this sort of raw wildness to it. And it's that wildness that can bring about that emotion when you stop listening to your thoughts and just lean into how you feel. And it has been known to lead some Jedi to the dark side because of that.
Speaking of the randomness, that's also why this is one of the best forms that someone could use against General Grievous. Because the whole way General Grievous takes out the Jedi is he analyzes their form, and through his cybernetic mind, his cybernetically enhanced mind, he then produces a form because he has them all downloaded and mapped out into his mind. He then downloads a counter to the Jedi's form. But because Shi-Cho possesses such a level of randomness, it makes it impossible for Grievous to compute what the Jedi is going to do next. And when Kit Fisto leans into the Force leans into that randomness, he uses the Force to defeat Grievous. And it makes it exceptionally dangerous against Grievous. The other reason it's so dangerous against Grievous is because it was meant to take out multiple opponents at once. And because Grievous has 4 lightsabers and he's attacking with 4 avenues, it makes it easier because Fisto and Shi-Cho wielders have become accustomed to dealing with multiple enemies at once. So Grievous coming at them as if he were 4 enemies, it doesn't really shake them whatsoever because that's what they've trained for.
Exactly. That's why I love this form and think it's so slept on. This one, like you said earlier, shares the similarity with Niman in that when you first learn it, it seems like you're not really going to get that far with it. But if you commit and just stick to your guns, you'll end up coming out as one of the most dangerous duelists, as we'll find out later.
Yeah, and Fisto, in the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, he lasts a little longer against Sidious.
That's true.
Obviously, in the film, he doesn't last anywhere near as long. But I think that sort of also speaks to the Testament. There are council members in that room, like Egg and Kolar, who use Form 5 Gem So, very similar to Anakin, who on paper should be able to overcome the might of Sidious, and he doesn't really stand a chance. But that is a testament to how far Fisto has grown, that he is able to, if ever so briefly, fight one of the greatest, most powerful Sith Lords that have ever lived. And I think that's another testament to it.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the novelization that he lasted longer. In the original script, in the original way they were going to map that out in Revenge of the Sith, battle was supposed to last longer for all the Jedi Masters. But as we know, Lucas wanted to do Ian McDiarmid instead of a stand-in stunt actor for the duel, so we didn't really get that, unfortunately.
Right. But I guess that sort of adds credit to the idea that in lore, Fisto is one of the better duelists on the entire council, making him one of the best duelists of the entire era.
Oh yeah, I would say I would put him right up against Plo Koon in that way.
Yeah, so he's knocking on top 5, definitely in top 10.
Absolutely. And I mean, we also got, I found out that apparently Kento Marek, which was Galen Marek's father, Starkiller, apparently he was a master of Shicho as well. And, he didn't do too shabby against Vader on Kashyyyk.
No, he didn't. The other one, and I know you haven't read these comics yet, but they're good, is Lucien Dre. He's also a Form 1 master, and Lucien was considered one of the better duelists of his era as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Was he a Jedi or a Sith?
He was a Jedi.
Okay.
He was the Jedi in the era where the Sith had been destroyed, and they were very, very worried that the Sith would return. And so they had a vision through the Force that they would return in the form of a young Padawan or someone among the Padawan group. And Lucien was a part Lucien was a part of the group that killed the Padawans in an effort to prevent the turn of the Sith. And he sort of spent the rest of his life atoning for that sacrifice. We'll have a full video detailing all of this, by the way, later, guys, if you're interested. But Lucien was one of the best duelists. Wild. No, that's super wild. Lucien was one of the best duelists of the era. And in my mind, when you're talking about Shicho, the two are Fisto and Dre for me. Kento Marek, he doesn't do terrible against Vader, but I mean, that's not really fair.
Yeah, it is like Darth freaking Vader after all.
Yeah, he's a dog. Like, you can't. Kento Marek, I'm sure, is more formidable than what he displayed against Vader, but to me, Fizz.
I mean, hey, he still in lore survived that battle, so
yeah. So, do we want to move on and talk about sort of the weaknesses of Shicho now? Now that we've built it up for the last 15 minutes, what are the weaknesses of Shicho?
Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk about it first off. In an era before blasters, this was kind of it. In an era before lightsaber dueling, those were two things we established first, and it is those two things where this form is lacking. There are much better options when it comes to blaster deflection. And unfortunately, unless you are edging into that sort of mastering territory of the wild randomness of Shicho, it's not super fantastic in a lightsaber duel either.
No. All of the skill of Shicho is at the very tip top. Most practitioners of it are never going to, get anywhere close. And that's the reality of this and Niman, is that at the end of the day, 1-to-1, it is one of the weaker forms. That's just, you can't really debate it, because it takes so long to master.
Unfortunately.
It takes so long to master, and it's particularly weak against the next form, Makashi, or Makashi.
Yeah.
Because that is all about precision. And when you have randomness and you come against a wielder who will, cut you apart like a surgeon with a scalpel, it's, you're not going to be able to do much.
Yeah, that is the unfortunate thing, is that what I was talking about earlier was lightsaber forms do actually fall into a sort of rock, paper, scissors type pecking order. And in that pecking order, it is Makashi that was developed pretty much as a countermeasure to Shicho whenever the 100-Year Darkness happened during the Second Great Schism.
Yeah. Makashi is developed as a response to saber combat, because in this era of conflict, both Jedi would be, a Jedi and a Dark Jedi would be utilizing Shicho. Obviously, they would want to take steps to develop a form that could counter that, and then we move in perfectly into Makashi. But do we have sort of a closing statement for Shicho? I'll give sort of a summarization. A form that's very easy to use. It is the foundation of all lightsaber forms, making it extremely important. With that said, most of the power lies in the 1% of the 1%, and all others would likely fall to more proficient wielders of other forms. That's sort of my closing statement for Shicho.
Yeah, I mean, my closing statement is that it is super reliable. I think that every Jedi should make an effort to super familiarize themselves with this form. But as you said, depending on what era, of course, that is super dependent on what we're talking about. If it's a time of peace or if it's a time of war, Shicho can find its place in either one, but there are just overall better options out there. So even though we pay a lot of respect to Shicho, it's not exactly like probably the best of the lightsaber forms.
So moving on, I'll go ahead and let you introduce one of my favorite forms, maybe my favorite ever, Form 2 Makashi.
Oh yeah. So cracking our knuckles into Makashi. This form, as we stated a second ago, was developed during the 100-Year Darkness. And of course, for those of you who don't know, that was around the time when the very first Dark Jedi were coming around. These would be the guys that would end up becoming the Sith Order that we know today. Whenever they split off from the Jedi Order, there had never been a war like this before. Well, there was one, the First Great Schism, but it wasn't as bad as this one. That one only lasted like a year. This one, literally, as the name said, lasted 100 years. And in those 100 years, Makashi was developed as a way to actually duel with other Jedi. And it is known as the contention form, or the way of the Ysalamiri. And it's kind of interesting that it's called that from that animal, because if you guys know, the Ysalamiri are a type of lizard that emit an anti-force field, and it can negate force powers. So it's like this form is literally named after a creature which is supposed to negate the abilities of Jedi and force users. Hence, it's also other named the contention form.
Makashi is developed to kill force wielders. That's just the truth of it. It's a turn, and it's a critical turn for lightsaber forms, because not only is it the first form invented to kill force wielders, it's also the first form invented to kill. Shicho,
You're correct.
Shicho was always disarm the enemy, crowd control. Makashi is destroy your opponent through precision, elegance, swiftness, and like a dancer. Makashi and Dooku, they're the same thing. Dooku is Makashi. And when he fights, he's described as fighting as if he is a dancer. He's not brutish with any of his movements. He's measured, controlled, fluid. He can kill an enemy with one very well placed stab, or he can deliver death by 1,000 cuts. He is the ultimate in this form. And I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. I think Makashi, in terms of obviously lightsaber combat, is one of the best, if not the definitive best. Only really competed, I would say, with like Vaipad, Juya, or Gemso. Other than that, it is one of the strongest forms. And the reason that the Jedi would ultimately move away from it is not because of some sort of combat disadvantage, although we will get into blaster fire in just a second, but more of the mindset of it, that it was meant to kill. It was meant to end conflict, likely via death of your enemy. And Dooku concerned a lot of the Jedi in the temple at the time because the Sith had been gone and because lightsaber wielders weren't especially prominent in the galaxy. So when a Jedi Knight, Jedi Padawan Dooku decided to master the form, it greatly concerned Yoda because he always sensed this sort of darkness within Dooku and a fascination with the lightsaber, and it made him inherently super dangerous.
People vastly underestimate how absolutely lethal Makashi can be. I mean, you look at it first and you're like, oh, this looks a lot like fencing. I mean, it's characterized by elegant strokes, quick jabs and cuts rather than like super powerful strikes. And it's very graceful, fluid, but that precision aspect of it, the ability to slip an opponent's guard and just dismantle them with very specific cuts or end it all with one well-placed thrust. I mean, that can be all she wrote in certain duels.
It just takes a single opening, and Makashi, practitioner's going to find that. You wrote in the notes why it's sort of averse to acrobatics, and you wrote that they do this in favor of moving along a single axis of footwork. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So whenever you're moving, let's take the excellent word picture of calling Dooku a dancer. Anyone who's familiar with dancing knows that it requires a very specific pattern of footwork. Ballroom dancing, for example, you're supposed to step in like a diamond-shaped pattern, and that's how they teach you, is they sort of draw it out with like tape on the floor. Well, imagine, if you will, that you're going to be drawing out on the floor with tape a cross, and you're going to be moving forward. You're going to tightrope that cross pattern, moving forward and backward, hardly ever crossing your own legs as you do so, and side to side along a very narrow and, direct pattern. And it's with that sort of footwork that you sort of stay grounded, and your footwork is what gives you power. People think about the motions that you're making with your lightsaber, but when you're moving the right way with your feet, that's what gives you leverage and positioning, and that's what creates those openings to get the slip on someone and end it all.
Or also step back and rely on your foundation and counter. A lot of people think about the offensive output of Makashi, but if you're moving backward and your feet never cross and you have that strong foundation, it allows you to take that step back, analyze, and then, if necessary, slip the guard then.
Yeah, those quick parries and those blocks and deflects are, it's what makes Makashi super solid in its balance of attack and defense output, because it allows users to preserve that energy and stamina and be able to spend it on making quick bursts of offensive movement, and it just really, you can dismantle someone very quickly and effectively with this form.
It's catching someone off guard based on pure skill alone. If you watch Dooku fight, especially in the Clone War, he will retreat, but his retreat is always meant with, it's always met with a parry. It's always met with, another strike. I think that some of the most impressive things Dooku's ever done is towards the end of the Clone Wars, fighting Anakin and Obi-Wan at the same time. Like you said, maintaining that sort of cross pattern, a strategic retreat. He's just
Right.
It's incredible to watch him do it. And a big misconception about Revenge of the Sith is that Anakin is fighting Dooku on the Invisible Hand on Dooku's best day. That's not true. The Revenge of the Sith novelization makes it very clear that this Dooku is, I'm gonna say it. He's a shadow of the Dooku on Geonosis, and he's definitely a shadow of Prime Dooku. And I think a Prime Anakin and a Prime Dooku duel would be far more competitive than what we saw in Revenge of the Sith.
I would have to agree with you there because, the thing about Makashi and, Dooku himself, who trained in it for so long, it's one of the most disciplined of all the forms. If you're meeting a Makashi master on their terms, it's going to take a lot to best them. You just said it. Makashi is literally the word skill issue put in a single lightsaber form. Yeah. If I'm being honest.
No, it is. It's very
but
interesting.
It's not without its. It is not without its drawbacks, though.
Correct. Now that I like this format. We build up the form. We talk about how. We attempt to make it sound like it's indomitable, but then we talk about the weaknesses. What are some of the key weaknesses for Makashi, and then how can someone overcome them? And then how in the end do the weaknesses overcome Dooku, and how does it become too much?
It will be this weakness, which was the death of Darth Tyrannus. For all of Makashi's strengths, it actually lacks that very word, strength. It lacks the ability to generate momentum in combat, and it leaves it very weak against power-based forms like Gemso or Juyo, which are very good at generating kinetic energy and can just freaking batter their opponents down. Makashi just doesn't do that. It doesn't have that ability to start gaining that velocity to power through someone. You really have to work on your surgical strikes, and its defenses and parries do carry that risk of not being able to meet other forms that can generate that momentum.
And when Anakin beats Dooku, the reason he beats him is that he eliminates his ability to parry. He is hitting him so hard that Dooku is not even capable defensively to hold off his attacks. He just attempts to move Anakin's momentum to other places, but Anakin just comes back at him faster and even stronger. And, Makashi's not a defensive-minded form entirely. And when Anakin puts him on that back pedal and keeps him there, the fight is lost.
The novel says it's like Anakin's first strike freaking bends Dooku's hand back, and he has to start spending lavishly on his reserve of force powers just to meet Anakin's strikes. And that's just not something that someone like Dooku can afford when your life is on the line in a battle.
And Anakin knew that. That's why he, attacked him that way. But talking about that weakness and talking about why Anakin did that, I also want to segue into something else that I find to be really fascinating. And that is that Darth Vader implemented this Makashi into his lightsaber form because, and I've said this again, Dooku was his greatest lightsaber instructor over the Clone War. Vader saw how proficient Dooku was with this form. He saw how proficient he was in duels, that Darth Vader took this lesson to heart and also used this as a part of his hybridized style.
He used a two-handed variant of Makashi and would even mend its weaknesses by using his knowledge of Gemso. So not only was his form decimatingly powerful, but it was surgically precise. Putting that precision and that measured footwork in with his Gemso ability, not only did it work well with the limitations of his armor, but I mean, he was able to just tear his opponents down.
And Vader doesn't use just one form. Vader hybridizes his
No.
style, which is
he definitely does.
which is important. And again, this isn't an analysis of Vader, but when we come to the forms, we will mention the forms and the pieces of the forms that he has decided to hybridize when we get to them. But another weakness of Makashi was it was weak against blast deflection or facing multiple opponents. But where this would be crippling against somebody like Shi Cho, who would be weak against the precision of Makashi, when it comes to Makashi, these weaknesses, they can be overcome. And I think Dooku proved that, and Vader proved that although it is weak inherently against blast deflection or multiple opponents, that is not necessarily the trump card that it would be, that generating momentum against it would leave it, unable to mount on an offense, whereas blast deflection and the multiple opponents can be overcome.
That's right. Dooku describes it like this. I don't have a source on this, but I remember somewhere it stating that Dooku mentioned that a true master of Makashi will be able to isolate his opponents and take them down one at a time, basically engaging in miniature 1v1 duels to systematically take apart an entire group of enemies. It's very Makashi in that way, as it's like, once again, we find that surgical precision of finding specific targets to take down in order to take down the enemy as a whole.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. So just closing thoughts on Form 2. It's one of the best offensive-minded forms. Dooku proved just how dangerous it is, and Vader proved the legacy of Dooku by taking pieces of what he had taught him as Anakin and implementing it into the duelist form, which this is. It is a form designed to kill. It doesn't necessarily speak to turning to the dark side, because while it's a form designed to kill, it also teaches measure and control.
Yes.
Where something like Shi Cho does not. Shi Cho preaches randomness and power. Makashi teaches elegance, control, refinement, which is why it can be used equally and loved equally by both Jedi and Sith.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This is one of those forms that it's impossible to say, like with almost every one of the other forms, you can put it in a box of, okay, yeah, this is primarily Jedi-minded, this could be primarily Sith-minded, but Makashi is one of those that can't be placed in either of those categories. It's the spork of the lightsaber forms. Both Jedi and Sith can very effectively use this form in each of either the light side or in service to the dark side.
I love it. Form 2, incredible. Now let's move on to S tier. No debate. Now let's move on to the Jedi lightsaber form. A Jedi lightsaber form so good that there are some Sith, the wisest of Sith, that realize how good it is, and they're like, okay, I need to take a page out of that Jedi's book. Let's talk about the form mastered by the Negotiator, the Sith Slayer, the Sith Butcher, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Form 3, Surisu, the Resilience form, the Way of the Minok, the Defensive style, the Sith trump card. The all-defensive
Dude, this is actually one of my favorite lightsaber forms.
Oh, how could you not love Surisu?
Right.
How could you not absolutely love Surisu? Obi-Wan kicks so much butt in the Clone Wars that Maul tries to use Surisu against Sidious because he realizes how powerful Sidious is, and he adopts that Surisu opening stance because Obi-Wan's been kicking his butt. He's been kicking his butt all Clone Wars, and Obi-Wan taught Maul a lesson that he has to fall back to the defensive style. So, Surisu, why was it developed? Well, my friends, it was developed because the Jedi were afraid that they were becoming too offensive-minded with Makashi thus leading more into the way of the pure Jedi, not the Jedi of the old order, but the Jedi Knights in their truest form, those that adhere to the light side of the Force, those that speak defense over offense, or defense being the best offense at all costs. So what does it do? Good question. No one asked. It is it's defined by being very tight, close to the body. You wrote down that it's as if wrapping the practitioner in a cocoon of defense, perfect against blaster fire, the best against blaster fire being defense.
No question.
Perfect against General Grievous. Again, multiple opponents' advantages. 4 lightsabers at once, no problem for General Kenobi. He can, create that perfect storm of lightsaber blocks that it is as if he is fighting as 8 people. He is that fast and he is that refined. But the incredible thing about Form 3 for me is everybody says that it just delays the inevitable. And by everybody, I mean Darth Bane. Darth Bane says that it delays the inevitable. If you're only a defensive-minded fighter, an offensive opponent will eventually break down your guard and beat you. Incorrect, Lord Bane. I'm sorry. Obi-Wan masters this by using it to conserve his energy and conserve his power in the Force. He never makes a movement.
Yes.
He never moves a millimeter more than necessary. And when a Sarisu practitioner sees the breakdown of an opponent's offensive sequences, that is when they strike. And they typically strike once, and they strike with as much output as possible, which is an underrated part of Sarisu. It is mostly defensive-minded, I should say. A lot of people classify it as entirely, but they don't take into account the conserving of energy, the waiting for the opening, the waiting. Where Makashi will pry an opening out of an opponent, Sarisu lets the opponent pry out their own opening.
Very patient. I mean, and what's interesting is you mentioned Darth Bane. He actually eats his own words later on in his life, because he ends up becoming very adept with Sarisu later on, to the point where he was practicing spinning his lightsaber over his head and created an umbrella of defense to where he was standing in the middle of a rainstorm and not a single drop touched him.
Not a single drop. Yeah, Darth Bane.
Which is just freaking dope.
Darth Bane adopted Sarisu. Darth Bane was not above saying that he's been wrong before, which is why he's so cool. And he adopted this Jedi style, this Jedi form. And, another thing that Bane sort of took from the Jedi was the idea of a single master and a single apprentice. But that's a different, topic altogether. But Sarisu was so good that those Sith that learned the smallest amount of humility agreed to the power of this Jedi lightsaber form. They saw the power. They saw how it allowed them to achieve the things that would be insurmountable. The biggest praise that you can give for Sarisu is that Obi-Wan Kenobi, an individual with the fraction of the Force potential of Anakin Skywalker, used Sarisu. He used the mindset of Sarisu as well. The calm, the controlled, the, waiting for the opening, which, was the shore of Mustafar in the case of that duel. And Obi-Wan, he held that energy in for as long as possible. And because of that, when Anakin really came to bear against him, Obi-Wan had the power to stop his offensive front, which is one of the most impressive lightsaber feats in all of the lore.
It is. The thing about it is I was reading in the Jedi Path while doing research for this, and the Battle Master said something about that Jedi are essentially instructed to be the eye of the storm when using Sarisu. This is the ultimate Jedi form, not only in how it's characterized by defense, but that Jedi are literally told to meditate while using it. And when that happens, their lightsaber moves on its own, creating that cocoon of defense to the point where they are literally untouchable. Obi-Wan, at the peak of his, at his peak in the Clone Wars, was said to be able to walk through a hailstorm of blaster fire on the front lines and not get touched at all.
And in his duel with Grievous, he's not actively thinking, I need to block this strike, I need to block this strike. He is meditating. He is the eye of the storm, and his body is answering all of Grievous's strikes naturally through the Force, and it becomes impossible for Grievous to break through his guard. And then later Anakin.
And yeah, and I mean, another really good thing about this form is it has a lot of survivability, not just in how it's defensively minded, but in that it is very energy conservative. You're not going to be spending a lot of breath using this form, which is why when that moment does come and you wait out the opponent's guard and you find that little window, that's why that strike becomes so devastating, because you're striking out with all the strength that you've got while they've been spending it trying to beat you down.
Yeah. And that is why, Sarisu practitioners can beat the wielders with like an insane offensive output, because they've been holding back. And where 1-for-1, a Sarisu wielder is not going to be anywhere near a wielder of, say, Gem So. If they can hold it back and strike at the right moment, they can win.
And because of that, it is very strong against offensively minded forms, except for one.
Yeah. It's essentially the underdog's form in a lot of ways.
I love it. I mean, even Darth Zana, Bane's apprentice, she was very short, a lot smaller than most average people, and Bane instructed her to use Sarisu with her saber staff to create a sort of double wall of defense.
So, with that said, Darth Bane beats Zana in their final duel blade to blade, right? She's no match for Darth Bane.
Right.
Why is that? What are some of the weaknesses of Sarisu?
So, okay. The one thing that is very obvious and known for is it's completely lacking when it comes to attack. And this, it just leaves very little in the way of mounting proper counterattacks. And while this may be one of the only weaknesses to the forms, it's a lot more glaring than people actually realize. Because Sarisu, it's all of the sequences that you train in, they're all defensive sequences. So whenever you do find that moment to attack, you're going to have to attack basically with a strike that you might have learned from another form, or from like Shicho or something. There's not really any Sarisu quote unquote attacks. That just doesn't really exist.
It would go against what it means to be the defensive form.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just because it was actually, sorry, let me get thoughts together.
No, you're good.
It was designed to fight against blaster wielders first and foremost. It was not originally designed for lightsaber combat, even though it could and very effectively is used in lightsaber combat. Because it was meant to get out of a blaster engagement alive. And it was only later more suited for saber-to-saber combat.
I would say with Sarisu, you sort of get one, maybe two chances if you're lucky. And if your counterattack, with the amount of energy that you've managed to accrue over time, over the course of the duel, if your opponent stifles that, if they can block that, if they can match that with more offensive output, you are done. The duel is over. There's not going to be a second go round of I need to conserve my energy, because once you expel that energy in a big final strike, if you miss or if it's not enough, the duel is over.
Yikes. That's a big yikes. I think that's why Obi-Wan is so powerful, is because he supplements the Sarisu's lack of defense with the offensive knowledge that he learned from Ataru, which we'll get into later. But that's why he's so strong with it, is because he does have defensive options, but people like Master Luminara doesn't, and she gets almost defeated by Ventress, even though she's on the Jedi Council.
Yeah, and I would say Obi-Wan's familiarity with, his ability to know when to strike is also what makes him so dangerous, is because, like you said, he did formally, as a Padawan, practice in one of the most offensive-minded forms there are. But when he saw Qui-Gon Jinn lose to an offensive fighter, with Qui-Gon trying to mount offense against offense and Qui-Gon getting tired, Obi-Wan never wanted that to happen. But what's important is that Obi-Wan did study Ataru for decades. And while Obi-Wan may not use Ataru sequences per se, he does have the knowledge of when to strike, which, like you said, someone like Luminara would lack.
Because he supplements his knowledge of Sarisu and being able to become the Eye of the Storm. In his meditations, he can literally intuit that moment the window arrives. He doesn't have to even see it. He just knows. He can feel it.
Yeah, he can. Exactly. He can feel it. The Force indicates to him the right moment, and the right moment exactly. But if you took someone like Luminara and you had them face Anakin, first off, her defense is not going to meet one of his strikes. It's not going to come close. But say she makes it all the way to the shores of Mustafar by some will of the Force, her one strike is not going to be enough to beat him at all. And Anakin,
no, it's not.
Anakin 1/10 his power, 1/10 the ferocity of that final blow is going to completely shatter Luminara's single chance, and he's going to destroy her, and he's going to destroy her to an embarrassing level. And again, that's why when we talk about these forms, we're talking about the greatest of the great of them, and Sarisu does have its limits if you're not General Kenobi.
And even as much as we've been talking up Obi-Wan, let's go ahead and call a spade a spade. He only won the Mustafar duel by the skin of his teeth. He had to rely on Anakin's arrogance and bait him into what he knew Anakin would do, and then use a forbidden lightsaber move to take him down.
Right. That's called a side talk, right?
I think what Kenobi did was a moquet.
Okay, side talk.
The side talk is whenever you bisect someone in half.
That's what he did to Maul.
Yeah, that's what he did with Maul.
Okay, come on, Obi-Wan. That's interesting. His big offensive outputs are, forbidden moves, which would catch, Anakin off guard.
Wild.
But,
that's so wild.
Like Yoda put it, destroy the Sith we must. At that point, Obi-Wan's willing to cut some corners in the lightsaber technique etiquette to take out Vader. Still, though.
I mean, was there a council left to reprimand him?
No. No order left.
Yeah.
But,
all right.
Form 3, let's move on. Let's do 4. I talked a lot about Sarisu.
Speaking of Yoda.
I talked a lot about Sarisu, so I'll let you lead this one, man.
Oh, it's all good. Form 4, Ataru. Probably one of the most common forms you are going to see in the Jedi Order, especially among young Jedi. If you are ever doubting what form a Jedi is using, it's very likely they're using some form of Ataru. I don't know why that is, but it is, from my research, it's one of the most common lightsaber forms practiced. And there's not any reason why it's not. It is known as the aggression form, or the way of the hawkbat, and for very good reason. It's characterized by the quick bursts of acrobatic movement and in being entirely centered on offense. That's what it's most known for. I mean, you can look at someone flipping around and know that they're just using Ataru. I mean, it's known for that tumbling and wild movement, kind of getting up in your enemy's face and overwhelming them with an onslaught barrage of attacks. What's interesting, though, is despite looking wild, it is one of the most disciplined forms, being very much like Makashi in that way. And the reason for that is that not only do you have to be very specific with how you're jumping and how you're moving your lightsaber in tandem with your body, but you have to incorporate the force in your movement. It very much requires a Jedi to use the Force to carry their body beyond its physical limits in order to perform those agility and body-bendingly aggressive moves.
Yeah, and Ataru was developed because of Sarisu's lack of offense. And it's a pendulum
that
swing.
Would be... I think it was actually Jim So that was developed by Sarisu users.
Really? So Ataru... Ataru was developed in... What's the mindset of the development of Ataru then at the time of the Jedi?
So what's interesting is Ataru is one of the only forms that doesn't have a very distinct starting point. It was seen as early as around the Mandalorian Wars. So basically around the time that Exar Kun was doing his thing, and then afterwards Ataru was what saw a big boom right before the Mandalorians started coming in and causing problems.
Do you think it could be...
As much as I looked in...
Do you think it could be a response to Exar Kun? Even though it may not be a direct one, he sort of shows up and lays waste to things, and the Jedi want to develop a more offensive mindset to take out an enemy like that?
You know what? I actually really support that theory. It only makes sense that you have a powerful Sith Lord who shows up when they thought the Sith were gone, and it's one of their own, and he proves that with enough blade skill, he can just dismantle anyone, even the most venerated Jedi Masters.
Which sort of leads into the... Now, Ataru before this point would have been around, but it likely would not have been as popular, is what you're saying, correct?
Yeah, I would say that.
So it may have been developed alongside the timeline around Sarisu. Ataru and Sarisu coming, close to one another.
I would say so, yeah.
And just sort of two avenues of thought. The Jedi Guardian and the Jedi Consular, if you will.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're always going to have two different schools who are going to be going for different ideas. So, whereas some people are looking at the fact that they need to respond to this big blaster industry boom, others are looking for stronger methods of offense that Makashi may not be able to generate.
Right. And when you talk about, Ataru is very popular among young Padawans because they're learning the Force and because they're giving into the idea of youth. It would be fun to bounce around. It would be fun to flip through the air. And that's why we see people like, Ahsoka, who it allows her to be aggressive and to be offensive despite her sort of smaller frame and her smaller stature. And it allows her to, enjoy the gifts of the Force, if you will. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, with the young Jedi and the youth of the temple, they're going to be wanting to explore the limits of what they can do with the gifts of the Force. And I mean, let's be honest, it looks cool.
Yeah.
It looks awesome to see a Jedi moving in ways that mortal beings can't. It's almost a representation of the distance between a Force user and a regular person.
Right. So, if I'm not mistaken, Anakin used pieces of this as well as Shien when he was a Padawan.
Correct. It would be Obi-Wan and Anakin who both would implement the footwork of Ataru, which is super interesting. We notice Anakin, unlike a lot of other traditional Gemso practitioners, one thing, we'll be talking about this much later, but Gemso has a problem with lacking the ability to have a lot of movement. But Anakin never has that problem because he's very light on his feet despite being able to generate as much power as he can. And he doesn't shy away from acrobatics either, and neither does Obi-Wan.
Right. I think a lot of why Anakin leans into it and why he becomes such a powerful duelist is because of Qui-Gon's defeat of Maul, or Qui-Gon losing to Maul.
Yeah.
And I think that Anakin sort of idolizes Qui-Gon Jinn and wants to use his form, but he also takes notes that Qui-Gon lost that engagement, which leads Anakin and Obi-Wan to explore different options in combat. And where Obi-Wan leads into more of a defensive mind, thinking why Qui-Gon Jinn may have lost, Anakin does the opposite, and he's like, if I can mount an even more powerful form, I can beat Maul, which I think is super interesting. Not necessarily more aggressive,
kind of
more powerful.
Right. It's kind of funny that their two avenues of thought echoes our theory of the Jedi Order having the two schools of thought following Makashi.
Right. And, you know, Exar Kun and the branching, some Jedi are going to go defensive-minded with Sarisu. You have your Kenobis, and others are going to search more offensive, you know, measures. Ataru, you have more of the Anakin mindset. No, that's a great point. But...
And, yeah.
I was just going to bring up Yoda. You know, we can't talk about Ataru
Absolutely.
without talking about the Grandmaster, without talking about debatably the greatest Jedi duelist up until that point in all of the lore. Legends Luke is going to take that title, obviously, but up until that point, Yoda, he's the best.
Mm-hmm. You know, for Yoda, this is where this specific strength and aspect of Ataru comes into play the most, which is its unique footwork in that it is not rooted on the ground. And we talked about this at length in our discussion some time ago with the approaches that Dooku and Sidious took to fighting Yoda, was that Ataru has three-dimensional footwork. It's not on the ground, it's up in the air, and we take that cross pattern that we talked about earlier with Makashi, right? And we're actually going to lift that off the ground and give it an axis right down the middle, the Z-axis, which is what Ataru gets to use quite often. And Yoda takes full advantage of that with someone of his size.
Yeah, because he's so small, he has to use Ataru because that's the only chance that he's going to get in terms of a duel. He has to break the pre-existing plane, and he has to be able to attack from all sorts of different avenues. And, you know, where younglings would use the Force because it's fun, Yoda uses it as a necessity. But because of that, Yoda's able to fight as if he were, you know, as if there were six of him. And what's always interesting about Yoda is the amount of energy and momentum that he generates with each of his blows. They are almost as close to a Gem So practitioner. So that speaks to Yoda's massive gifts in the Force, first of all, that he's so small, but if you're going to meet Yoda blade for blade, he can smash through your guard. And, you know, that's going to be where a lot of the individuals that fall short against Yoda fall short. And that's their, you know, inability to generate a good defense. You know, Sidious deals with the offensive output of Yoda. And when they have their blade lock, Yoda is the one that's in control most of the time because he's able to generate even more energy than Sidious is in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that Ataru is known for, is that kinetic energy aspect, which is very interesting in the fact that it is apparently weak to Makashi, but of course it's not. But that's for a different reason entirely, which is that the elegant strokes of Makashi are able to keep an Ataru user grounded and thus keeps them from using their kinetic energy.
And their greatest strength. By keeping them on
Exactly.
the ground and stopping them from generating enough energy, they're able to, you know, force them to fight them on the two-dimensional plane and not giving into the biggest advantages that it holds But going with that, another one of the weaknesses is the massive amounts of energy that it takes. And how good
That's true.
how good an Ataru wielder is going to be is going to be determined on how much energy they have. Where you have someone like Qui-Gon Jinn who doesn't have anywhere near the force limits that someone like Yoda does, that he can be weighted out, which is exactly what Maul did. In a lot of the sources and a lot of the novels that talk about Maul and Qui-Gon's duels, one that I was reading recently was that Maul was shocked with how competent and how scary of a duelist Qui-Gon was on Tatooine. He was expecting the sands to not allow Qui-Gon to generate enough momentum to stop Maul, and it was Maul's plan to kill Qui-Gon right there. But when Maul went in...
That's crazy.
Yeah, when Maul went in for the killing blow, he was shocked that Qui-Gon not only met it with equal offense, but that he was not unbalanced by the sand. And that is why the next time Darth Maul fights Qui-Gon Jinn, he does so extremely intelligently because he realizes how massive of a threat Qui-Gon is. Qui-Gon is the first major challenge with Darth Maul. I forget the name of the book, but you get in Maul's head, and he talks about how Qui-Gon is able to meet his strength and how he hates this and how he does not like it. And how
That's so cool.
it doesn't scare him, I would say, but it absolutely surprises him. And that is why he has to lure Qui-Gon into the reactor room and wait him out, essentially. Now, someone like Yoda, Maul would not be able to wait out. Yoda would mount an offense and mount a form of aggression so powerful that it would break down Maul. But I think Maul talking about how dangerous Qui-Gon is also him acknowledging how dangerous Ataru is.
Yeah, and it is, and it's because of that the weaknesses of Ataru are very unique, because they're not weaknesses that people are going to immediately know. If you're not prepared to fight an Ataru user, you will get overwhelmed and defeated quickly, because that's what the form is meant to do. Only those who are familiar with Ataru have to strategize around it. So either waiting out the user and having them spend their energy, or luring them into a confined space, which we've talked about Ataru being weak before. And I actually really find that to be one of the most interesting aspects about Ataru, is that you have to strategize around it in order to take advantage of its weaknesses.
Yeah, and if you're arrogant, like someone like Sidious, when you're finally met with the full offensive output of Yoda, you're going to have to put your lightsaber away. You know, Sidious doesn't lose lightsaber. Well, he loses a few times, but he's the top of the top. And for Sidious to put his lightsaber away against an Ataru wielder is another massive testament to the form. Sidious and Maul both use Juyo or Juya, and Ataru is the Jedi's answer to that in a lot of cases. It's the Jedi's aggression form, but it is also, like you put, measured and controlled when Form 7 leans into being more wild. It's sort of the unleashed version of Ataru. And when I say unleashed, I don't necessarily mean better. It's just a different way of being aggressive with the lightsaber.
Yeah, exactly. On a note of Darth Maul and Ataru and Yoda, I remember whenever the Star Wars Battlefront 2 trailers were coming out, and it always had that opening with Yoda and Darth Maul standing off on Naboo. And I always, whenever I would see those trailers, I always thought that was so ridiculous. I was like, do you understand how fast and how easily Yoda would defeat Darth Maul?
Yeah. There are levels to it.
Man.
There are levels. I mean, the biggest debates I see are like Yoda versus Vader and Yoda versus Anakin. And I don't even have a firm answer on Yoda versus Vader. I think Yoda would take Anakin at Revenge of the Sith, just because of his mindset. But when it comes to Vader and Yoda, that's like the toughest debate for me. I think that goes either way.
For some people, it is. I was actually going to mention this off recording because I don't want to make a whole bunch of people mad. But I actually almost get mad whenever I see Yoda versus Vader. I think Yoda would win low diff.
Really? That's fascinating.
Yeah, I always hate whenever I see those polls out. I'm like, who thinks Vader can win against Yoda? But apparently, a lot of people. Apparently, it's a hot debate. And I may get comment braised about this, but I really don't think that Vader holds any candle to Yoda at all.
You see, I don't agree with that, which is interesting because we agree, I would say, on 99% of all of Star Wars debates.
I would say so, yeah.
I think that Vader is just the ultimate duelist. I think that he's hybridized a form and taken it to a level that Yoda just hasn't. And I think that, Vader learning from Dooku and Vader learning from Obi-Wan and taking elements of Anakin. I know that Vader has inherent weaknesses, but to say that it would be low difficulty is, I don't think that that's giving Vader his flowers,
I mean, I guess I can agree with that, and maybe I might have been aggressive when I said low diff, but I really don't think that Vader is going to win against the Grand Master of 800 years of Ataru experience. I mean, Yoda has studied all forms of lightsaber combat, but he has brought his mastery of Ataru to a place that no one has ever seen before. Darth Sidious, who can still best Darth Vader, could not defeat Yoda. And of course, I think that it's also worth mentioning that Darth Vader would probably have a much better time against Yoda in whenever he's much older on Dagobah.
Oh yeah, that's not the Yoda I'm talking about. I'm talking about Revenge of the Sith.
Right,
Yoda.
No, but Revenge of the Sith Yoda versus prime Darth Vader, I think it would be it would honestly be mid to high diff, but I think Yoda still wins. Both at the blade and at force ability.
Interesting. See, the reason that Sidious puts his lightsaber away against Yoda is because Yoda is more skilled with the lightsaber, right? And Sidious acknowledges that. But to me, Vader is far and away far superior with the blade than Sidious ever was. Vader obsessed over it. He, it was his mission as a Jedi and as a Sith, and he has way more experience. So this whole goes into the debate that we always run into with Star Wars, which is it's not ABC logic,
Right, that is true.
And I just think that Yoda is the culmination of 800 years of Jedi, but Vader is the culmination of the fallen chosen one and of the greatest Jedi killer in the history of the Order. Now, am I saying that Yoda would be able to beat Vader, or Vader would be able to beat Yoda without any, difficulty at all? Of course not. It would be the hardest fight of his entire life. But I think that Vader would have a chance. I think it can go either way, but, we're going to have to see. Vader is so tough to pin down. Yeah. And I just want to say...
Yeah, he is kind of hard to quantify sometimes.
I just want to say that me talking right now, I'm using and in my mind thinking of more moments from Legends than I am from canon. Because, when Sayre beats Vader or comes close to it, that makes me go oh, yeah, Yoda would curb stomp him. But when I think of the Vader who's beating people like Anya Kuro, who's killing, 6-7 Jedi at once, whose lightsaber is deactivated and kills 3 more Jedi, that's the sort of Vader I'm thinking of.
And I can respect that. I'm over here still thinking, though, we just talked about how Yoda, we talked about the other week, Yoda being able to slip inside the guard of another hulking monstrosity like General Grievous, and he's able to climb him like a jungle gym easily. And of course, obviously Grievous doesn't hold a candle to Vader, but it is known that Vader has a hard time moving around in his suit. That's why he had to hybridize his form so specifically and fine-tune his style like that. I really think that Yoda would be able to make Vader's head spin, and he would be able to keep Vader on his toes before like dismantling him.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, he'd be able to get and attack Vader's, like, vital spots, such as the chest plate or the buttons on his belt, too.
Yeah, the way I would counter that would just be that I think Vader is, like, the most intelligent duelist maybe that we've seen ever. And to where Sidious tries to meet Yoda with aggression, I think Vader, also because of the durability of his armor. I know we talk about the drawbacks of his armor, but it also makes him far more durable. I think that Vader goes on the defense, and I think that he tries to wait Yoda out. That's how I think Vader would try to beat him.
My only counter to that is that I think Yoda would definitely do a hawk bat swoop up high, and Vader cannot lift his arms above a certain point on his chest. So one strike to his helmet, and he can end it pretty good.
Yeah, I know that there are a few different like claims. Some have said that he can't do that. Others say that he can, but with extreme difficulty. That's sort of the camp that I've always leaned into, is that he can lift his arms above his head, but that it causes him mass amounts of pain. I know that there may be contradicting sources on that, but I have heard both.
Probably are. Because the source that I have is the Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, where it says it's like that, it's not that it pains him, but that chest plate keeps his arms from moving above shoulder level.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the way.
I think what I am pulling from is probably a visual dictionary somewhere, is where I remember reading that.
Okay.
It may be the Revenge of the Sith visual dictionary that says he has a hard time. But that's why Star Wars can be so confusing, is because it's like, okay, which is it? You know?
Unfortunately, and that's just kind of the way of legends. Honestly, we could hash out the Yoda versus Vader debate could be its own discussion video, honestly. We'll be here all day if we tried to do that.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to sideline that for another debate. And I think it would be cool if we both, did some pretty good research and then came back at it with, I'll take Vader's side and then you could take Yoda's side, and we like hash it out. Mm-hmm. And that's not saying come.
Oh, that's going to be fun.
That's not saying come to an agreement. That's just saying propose our arguments. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
With that said, this isn't going to be any different for you guys, but we're going to take a break and we'll come back and we will be discussing forms 5, 6, 7, and then some variants of them, talking about Trickata and Form 8. So nothing's going to change for you guys, but we're going to take a break for the recording. And, let's get back into it. Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to continue now our discussion with obviously Form 5. Form 5 is compelling and different because now we're reaching a deviation with the forms where there are going to be two different ways of applying Form 5, a variant of it, if you will. The initial Form 5 is known as Shien, known as the Perseverance form, the way of the Krayt Dragon. It was developed by Surisu practitioners that wanted to have more of an offensive output. Again, we talked about one of the weaknesses of Surisu in 3 being delaying the inevitable, as Darth Bane would put it, and not a lot of counter-attack options. We mentioned with Surisu, if you can generate one big counter-attack and that's sort of all you have, it's again just delaying the inevitable, and you will eventually be struck down. So Form 3 developed Form 5 Shien, the first variant, for that sole purpose, to allow them more avenues of counterattack, allowing them to generate more than one offensive output through their defensive sequences in an attempt to get rid of that one weakness that we touched on with Surisu. Shien was mainly developed with the idea of deflecting blaster bolts. Again, sort of the evolution of the Jedi in this time period, where before, like, Form 1 didn't have blaster bolts or blasters in general in the galaxy, but now that time has progressed, that's become the prominent, most dominant weapon in the entire galaxy and across the stars. And as peacekeepers, the Jedi had to develop a form specifically tailored for that. With that, though, one of Xian's big weaknesses is it's not very good in a duel. That's not to say, though, that Form 5 isn't very good in a duel, because the variant Gem So is essentially the dueling form besides Makashi, if you will. It's made for individuals who are much larger. You're going to see, as we break it down further, individuals like Malgus really embody Gem So. Anakin brought his offensive might and his physical strength to bear in Gem So. And then Vader, although he used a hybridized form, Gem So was the backbone of that. It is the more aggressive of Xian, obviously, solely made for lightsaber combat in most scenarios, following the idea of turning an enemy's attack back against them. Gem So's fluid riposte is meant to deflect the kinetic energy of an enemy's attack back on them and follow up with a counter-strike. So it's offense stacked on offense, right?
Very cool. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I love that idea. The ability to turn an opponent's kinetic energy against them. That sounds just so interesting. It's a very unique aspect about Gem So specifically, where it has very applicable dueling techs that you don't see in a lot of other forms, except for maybe Makashi.
Yeah, and that's why those two forms, they pair off together so nicely. And that's why the duels between Anakin and Dooku are so interesting, because they're the two duelist forms, if you will, but they still have different approaches. One is meant to be very swift and direct, and what's another way to explain it?
Precise.
It's fluid in its own regard, precise. Again, we explained that it was sort of like a dancer dueling.
Right.
This Gem So is more of like a boxer, I would say, than a ballerina. You know,
yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Keeping the intensity on, their opponent, and keeping them on the back foot by any means necessary, to the point where they're taking their own attacks and forcing the energy back against them. As we saw in Ahsoka, Anakin in The World Between Worlds sort of executes Gem So like masterfully. He's able to push Ahsoka back. He's able to absorb whatever offensive output she's going forward with and counter it. And as we've put it before, Anakin has absolutely mastered Gem So in The World Between Worlds.
Yeah.
And he came close to mastery in Revenge of the Sith. It got to the point where he was dueling Dooku, where Dooku, as we mentioned, he couldn't mount on offensive defense or a substantial defense, and he was sort of forced to just let Anakin's strikes hit him and attempt to guide them out of his path as best he could, which, of course, in the end resulted in Anakin just smashing down what little defense he could generate. But Anakin's the obvious person to talk about when we talk about Gem So.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Malgus, man, because Malgus is a tank.
Oh, yeah.
He's Palpatine's essentially favorite Sith Lord. He is always what he envisioned Darth Vader to be and what Palpatine hoped that Darth Vader would become like. Never quite. But Malgus is very similar to Vader in the fact that they're both brutes, and they win the majority of their duels off of their strength alone. But where Vader integrates more of a hybridized style, Malgus leans completely into Gem So.
Yeah.
And I would say that Malgus is even a better example of a Gem So practitioner than Anakin, because one of the major weaknesses of Gem So is its lack of footwork and sort of mobility that's granted via that footwork. And we know that that's very popular with Anakin, and the Anakin adopts pieces of Form 4, Ataru, to compensate for that weakness, to sort of grant him more mobility. And it's him taking the footwork of Ataru and implementing it into the strikes of Gem So that ultimately allows him to win the day against Dooku. But Malgus leans completely into Gem So. He is attempting to smash down his opponent's guard, not only through superior skill, but superior force. He is an offensive powerhouse, and I think just the perfect example of Gem So.
He definitely brings Gem So into its purest form. If you're looking at, like you said, whereas Anakin likes to hybridize his style a little bit, implementing a Taru footwork to give himself a little bit more mobility, Malgus makes no compromises anywhere. He took Gem So by the throat and literally just hammered down on it, probably becoming more of a barbarian than someone like Darth Bane, who even hybridized his style a little bit.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that a lot of the Sith Lords are choosing this as their foundation, but they're also implementing other forms, wherein Malgus decides not to do that? I think that that's compelling.
It is. It is. I always enjoy watching Malgus fight because when you first look at him, you think his moves are pretty simple, like his wider swings, and he's got them power blows. But when you watch his technique, he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows everywhere his blade is about to fall, and he knows exactly how to follow up. Even though he's grunting and smashing his way through his opponent, he's not losing control of himself. He's very contained and knows what he's doing. And I think that's what makes Gem So especially dangerous.
Yeah, its ability to mount that counterattack with brutality and extreme force. My favorite moment with Malgus is in his duel with Venzalo, where if you've read some of those books, you know that when Venzalo hits him with the elbow to the face, that Malgus intentionally let that physical strike slip his guard so that Venzalo would open himself up to a counterattack, and Malgus would be able to deliver the killing blow.
Oh, that's cool.
And I think
I didn't know that.
I think that that's fascinating because Venzalo, was an expert of Form 4,
right?
Very aggressive. And again, we go back to what we talked about in our intermission, which is appropriate. The Dataru was followed by Gem So, that Yoda used Dataru and Vader used Gem So. But it's interesting that we sort of got something like that, granted with two duelists that are likely not on the level of a Yoda or a Vader. Malgus is closer to Vader than Venzalo is to Yoda. But I think that they're pretty close. And another thing that's interesting is that Satele also, as you've pointed out in our notes, used Ataru as well.
Right.
So Malgus is used to fighting against these duelists that use Ataru. And I'd also like to point out that he wins both of those duels.
I was literally about to say something similar. I was like, yeah, and he absolutely mops them both times.
Which is incredible. And the idea that he realizes how aggressive his opponent in Venzalo is being, and he allows that one strike to get through so that he can then open himself up for the counterattack, is the definition of Gem So. Now, do I have faith that Malgus could have, hit him with all of the aggression that Gem So had and eventually win the day against Venzalo? I do believe that, but it's the intelligence. And another part of Gem So that a lot of people don't really talk about is it is slightly more reserved than an Ataru or a Juyo, which is why it's so dangerous, because it's equally as powerful in terms of generating force, but at the same time, it is more reserved. It's fluid, whereas it's not as random or ferocious as a 7 or a 4. And that's why of all the lightsaber forms, I think that Gem So, in terms of effectiveness in a duel, is definitely up there in contention for the first and best form possible.
It's definitely an S tier lightsaber form. You can see how Malgus, when he's fighting someone like Calcin Derek, who is the Jedi Battlemaster, very familiar with combat, took out Darth Vendikin by tricking him. Malgus ends up rushing him down and generating an insane amount of momentum in a very short amount of time, and absolutely batters that Jedi down to nothing. Like, he's dead before we really even see what happened in some of the time.
Yeah, and it's just that ability to mount the Force, deflecting an enemy's, as you wrote, kinetic energy, and then right back into a counterattack.
Now, something that you had mentioned earlier, and I kind of wanted to touch on this a little bit, is you don't seem to find Shien to be a very compelling form.
No, yeah, we talked a little bit about this off recording. It's kind of boring. It doesn't. It is boiled down to the fact of, like, they're blaster wielding foes. We are Jedi. We have to learn how to have, a capable offensive base mixed with a capable defensive base. But I think the reason it's boring for me is because it has very little to do with dueling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more so about, like, a response of the state of the galaxy.
Yeah, I think I can see that. I think its big calling point is that whereas with Sarisu, deflecting blaster bolts was more about redirecting them or just absorbing the bolts in your wall of defense, Shien took this idea of just blocking blaster bolts and actually developed the style of reflecting them back at the target, which was something that hadn't really been seen before and took a lot of skill.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something to keep in mind. I was going to make the point that you wrote in the notes also that a lot of Jedi questioned whether or not Gemso and Shien were maybe necessarily appropriate for a Jedi to use, specifically Gemso. But I would make the argument that Gemso is sort of what it means to be a perfect Jedi Guardian in terms of the individuals that go out into the galaxy that are active protectors, and, they need that offensive backbone. Now, obviously, the best examples of it are going to be Sith, who don't just use it as a method to protect, but as a method to conquer instead. But I do think that Gemso has grounds to remain in the Jedi Order.
It most certainly does. Before Luke became more of a practitioner of several forms, his main form was Form 5. I think he used Shien a little bit more, but especially when dueling Vader in Return of the Jedi, he was using Gemso. And he championed that form as, like, the secret to it for using it as a Jedi was compassion. And this is one thing that a lot of people kind of misunderstand. They're like, okay, how does the most aggressive form out of all of them, how do you be compassionate while using something like that? And the way that I would explain it is that you're going to want to end a fight quickly as a Jedi. You're not trying to draw out a confrontation, and it's the compassion to have on your opponent to be like, you're in the wrong. I need to end this fight quickly with as little damage to you, myself, and those around me as possible. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to put you down quickly. And compassion is also the secret to the restraint that is required with Form 5. Because when you build that momentum, it's very easy to just continuously attack on that forward offense until you just destroy your opponent. But once you break their guard and get them down, that's when you know how to pull back with your compassion and know the fight is over. I have won.
Yeah, and that's what it means to be a Jedi.
Absolutely.
And that's what, as you pointed out, that's what Luke does, is he learns how to pull himself back from using Gemso and how to use that appropriate force, but also at the same time ending the use of that force. So going back to Shien, again, it's not my favorite lightsaber form. I struggle to think of any true master of Shien who is on the level of like an Anakin or a Plo Koon, because Plo Koon apparently used more Gemso than Shien. I know Shakti has been known to use Shien too, but even she leans more into Gemso from what I was just reading up. It seems like the most popular wielder of Shien is Ahsoka Tano in the Clone Wars early on. She adopts that reverse grip of the lightsaber that is sort of similar to Shien.
Right.
And I guess Galen Merrick's Starkiller also uses pieces of Shien too. But even those examples are a little bit shaky because they also incorporate, in Ahsoka's case, Ataru, and in Starkiller, Galen Merrick's case, Juya. So I struggle. Obviously, the purpose of Shien is not to become some sort of premier duelist. That's not the idea behind it at all.
No.
But it is used to transition those that want to be duelists into Gemso, where I think of Gemso as more of the evolution of Shien, because if you're gonna practice Gemso, you have to know Shien very well, and an individual that uses Shien perfectly, in my opinion, is Vader. We constantly see his skill with blast deflection, and that is off of the backbone of Shien. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when we're talking about dueling, he transitions more into Gemso. So again, Shien, kind of a style that I'm not in love with, but I don't think anyone really is.
It's kind of hard to fall in love with a style that is more geared towards facing blaster-wielding opponents, because it's obviously not going to get as much flash and spotlight as the dueling forms do, because anyone who has tried to use Shien in a duel has failed very quickly. I mean, that's why Anakin got his arm cut off with on Geonosis, is he took the two lightsabers, switched to Shien, and Dooku just cut him to pieces. And it really shines more when you have a Shien user in a field of blaster wielders, because it's actually very strong against multiple opponents. And Anakin, as a Padawan, impressed both Luminara and Barriss with how easily he was able to take down a huge gang of thugs using his Shien style.
Yeah, so it definitely does have, times where it's applicable, but I mean, Anakin evolved into Gemso and was just as capable against blaster wielders,
Yeah.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
What are some of the weaknesses? What are weaknesses of 5 Gemso? What styles counter it?
Well, it's kind of hard to pick a lot of styles that counter Gemso because of how good it is. But one style that certainly does stop it in its tracks is the ultimate defense form to counter the ultimate attack form. Sarisu does, in my opinion, counter Gemso pretty evenly.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it, evenly.
Yes.
It's the different side. It's the opposite side of the coin, where Sarisu was all about the defense and mustering up, that one big attack.
Right.
Gemso is about, meeting those attacks and also trying to have a defensive base, but at the same time have that defensive base lead to more offense. So you could see why the form meant to stop the offensive form would be the defensive form. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's just who is more skilled or who is more centered that's going to come out on top of those two.
It's one of those things where it's not a trump card. Sarisu is not going to... it's not like when you have Makashi versus Shicho, where Makashi is a hard counter to that form. But you're going to find that Sarisu is more of a soft counter, because while it doesn't just immediately trump the attack form, it does mitigate a lot of its advantages. Because Sarisu doesn't attack very often, so that takes out the advantage of the fluid repost, of Gemso being able to take an opponent's kinetic energy and bring it back on them. If your opponent is not generating kinetic energy, you can't use it against them. And thing number 2, Sarisu conserves energy, and this is actually going to lead into the next weakness of Gemso, is that it's extremely physically demanding. It's actually known to be more physically demanding than even Ataru. And if you can't overwhelm your opponent quickly, drawn out battles, unless you're Dark Side Anakin or just Anakin in general, longer battles are going to be a Gemso user's enemy, because a Surisu master can just take and take and take their attacks, theoretically, of course, theoretically speaking, and just weaken them down.
I think
tire them out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the easy, comparison is obviously Anakin and Obi-Wan. So I want to give another one to you. Darth Zana and Darth Bane's final duel. So Bane ultimately beats Zana using Gemso, or, it's not an outright complete victory, but Zana, because she's a master of Surisu, she is able to use that to fortify herself long enough to gain the energy necessary to use Sith magic against Bane, which ultimately wins her the day. Which is another way to think of it, is that Bane's massive offense versus Zana's defense does eventually garner Zana enough time, which I think is an interesting, sort of counter as well. Or another example of the two forms clashing.
Yeah.
But Bane also used Surisu, though, so he kind of had the best of both worlds. I've often described Bane as like, imagine if you took Obi-Wan's style and Anakin's and put it together. Isn't that terrifying?
Yeah, it's extremely terrifying because he was very good at both forms, very good.
Yeah, which is why he's on this list. But obviously, what I think is unique about Bane, and that's something that we covered in a recent video, was he sort of talks down a little bit about defense while at the same time, mastering Surisu for himself. What's your interpretation of that? What's sort of the reasoning for that?
And this is going to sound weird, like kind of like a justification, but hear me out, right? So it is known that Bane, during the time of the rule, like if you look at the Baneite trilogy and you got like Path of Destruction, The Rule of Two, and then Legacy of Evil, or I think that's the name of the third book, I don't remember, but Dynasty of Evil, that's what it's called. So he does most of his historical recording during the Rule of Two era. Now, during this era, he was wearing the Orbalisk armor. This was around the time that he perfected the ability to make a holocron, and that's when he recorded all of his knowledge. During that time, he was not studying Surisu. He had forwent all of his defense because he had the Orbalisk armor and focused entirely on Gemso. So a lot of the things that he wrote around that time that we probably are reading in the Book of Sith, like all his chapters, his opinions are going to be very centered on his opinions at that point in his life. It was only in his old age, in Dynasty of Evil, did he actually start practicing and perfecting Surisu, because he had to make up for the fact that he no longer had the Orbalisk armor. So I think it was honestly a matter of age, and if he had rewritten his chapters, he probably would have had different opinions.
Way more mature by the end. He got rid of the roid rage.
I love that.
Yeah, Bane is smart, man. So smart. Another one of the weaknesses, again, is sort of the lack of mobility that you touched on.
Yeah.
And we praise Anakin all the time because he got rid of that weakness by, studying Ataru and implementing it into Gemso and creating sort of the ultimate version of Gemso, if you will.
I agree.
He doesn't really ever have a problem with mobility.
No.
But that isn't to say that people that just practice Gemso don't have that problem. But something that I want to talk about is because Anakin loses in Revenge of the Sith to Obi-Wan, people sort of misinterpret his power level and where he is and just how good Anakin is.
No.
And I just want to take a second and clearly say Anakin Skywalker is the probably second best duelist in the galaxy at this time.
I agree.
Right behind Yoda. And his power level should not be understated. Anakin in Revenge of the Sith is absolutely one of the most powerful Jedi that has ever lived. And that's all the old masters, that's counting Luke. And just because he loses, his power in that form is diminished. But I just want to make it clear that I think that he is, one of the best in all of the lore at that point in time.
To add on to that, I think that, again, like we talked about all the time, you make sure to mention this as often as you get the chance to. Power scaling in Star Wars does not follow an ABC logic. Just because this guy beats this guy does not mean this one will be able to beat the other one. It's we need to take a look at the facts and know that Anakin had Obi-Wan on the ropes. That shore that Obi-Wan found was his saving grace, and that's made pretty clear in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, that Obi-Wan himself was starting to get tired. Anakin was only getting stronger over the course of that fight because he was feeding into the dark side. Had that gone on any longer, or had Obi-Wan not taken advantage of Anakin's arrogance, he would have lost.
Yeah. The part in the Revenge of the Sith novel that I love and that I sort of chuckle at is, I think it's when they're in the hallway and you're in Obi-Wan's perspective, and he's clashing with Anakin and he's meeting Anakin's blows and he feels himself weakening, and he has the thought that simply just says, "Oh, this is bad." I don't know if you remember that part in the novel.
Now that you say that, I do.
Yeah, and I that always just like stuck with me, that Obi-Wan is Anakin's no joke, man. And Obi-Wan gets lucky at the end. He gets lucky, or the will of the Force, he gets lucky. And he preys on Anakin's own weaknesses mentally, but not with the form. Like, if Anakin had put his pride away, if he had, maybe stepped onto the shore of Mustafar, that duel ends with him on top. And that is just something that so many people miss. Like, not to take away from General Kenobi.
Sure.
Honestly, like, the best Surisu wielder in all of the lore, period, I would probably go to say, even after him. But, like, Anakin is just another level. And Gemso, that's why, Anakin's version of Gemso, it might just be perfect. It might just be the best single lightsaber form, period. And his only real competition, in my opinion, is himself later on in Vader. And that hybridized form where he takes, Makashi and Surisu, and he takes from the people that taught him during the Clone Wars and Kenobi and Dooku, and creates that hybridized style. And then obviously you can throw in Luke later, but like those three, that's like the top in my opinion.
I wanted to say something really quick concerning Anakin's lightsaber form. As good as it is, we need to remember something very important. That style was perfect for Anakin. If anyone else tried to use Anakin's style, they would tire out so fast, because it is a very high energy way of fighting, because he's combining the energetic footwork of Ataru, which is already demanding, with the blade strikes and form of Gemso. Because he is the chosen one, has a lot of reserves in his stamina, because he's young as well. He can pull upon the Force to continuously revitalize himself and keep himself going in battle. I think that's what makes Anakin such a dangerous duelist, is because he's so strong in the Force. I really feel like if anyone else tried to use his version, they would probably get caught with their pants down if a duel prolonged, any farther than it needed to.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that completely. Anakin is the chosen one. His reserves are maybe limitless, maybe. I don't think Anakin was getting tired with Obi-Wan. That duel could have gone on much longer. Like you were saying, the more he's giving into the dark side, the longer in the duel he's getting more powerful. He's getting more dangerous. And that's not normal.
No. I think his energy in that duel was only starting to peak when they were fighting on the lava platform, in my opinion. When Obi-Wan
has to ditch.
Yeah, when Obi-Wan was when his energy was starting to wane and was getting at its when he was like running on empty, Anakin was just then starting to peak.
Yeah. And I can guarantee Anakin smelled blood, and I can guarantee he knew it.
Like that.
which is probably why he attempted the maneuver that he did at the point that he did, because he was surging, and he could tell that Obi-Wan was reaching. His gas tank was almost on empty.
All right, so we've been talking about Form 5 for 30 minutes. Do you have any closing thoughts?
And we didn't even talk about Luke yet.
No, we haven't.
I'll be quick with the Luke. Like you said, Luke perfects Gemso in a different way. He exercises the restraint that Anakin didn't when he used Gemso. He viewed it as a way to end the fights as quickly as possible through sheer offensive output, whereas Anakin sort of let himself run wild. So I will just say that Luke embodies what it means to be a Jedi practitioner of Gemso, and if Anakin represents sort of the highest degree of it, Luke represents the highest degree of it, not only in the form itself, but from the mental standpoint and the ethical standpoint of a Jedi. So that's my quick Luke thoughts.
No, I totally agree with that.
Ending comments on Gemso, I don't really think any are necessary.
No.
I think it's great.
Yeah, S tier.
I think it might be the best.
Absolutely.
S tier, I mean, easy.
Easy.
That's why we spent 30 minutes on it. But I'll let you go ahead and take off Nyman. Not one of my favorite forms again, unfortunately, Nyman, except for Darth Krayt. But we'll talk about that.
I'll let you take part of the Darth Krayt discussion. I actually do have quite a bit to talk about when it comes to Form 6. In my opinion, on this channel, we have been known to put down Niman quite a bit. I know that one video about how all the Niman users on Geonosis got murked, and there's definitely a reason for that. I actually think that when utilized properly, Niman is one of the most underrated lightsaber forms. And that's not entirely its fault, though. And I'll go ahead and kind of talk about it. So it is known as the moderation form, also known as the Way of the Rancor. I kind of disagree with that animal placement for this form, but whatever. It's actually more commonly known as the Diplomat's form. This was because Niman was mostly used by Jedi consulars and Jedi who weren't going to be seeing a lot of action. So basically, it is a hybrid. It is meant to be a hybrid of all the previous forms that we mentioned to create a style that was more practical for those who just didn't fight. This was basically the Swiss Army knife of the lightsaber forms. It didn't have any specific strengths to it, except for the fact that it was very versatile. But with that, it didn't have any specific weaknesses either. But we'll kind of get into that in a minute. Niman was actually not created by the Jedi, surprisingly enough. But a long, long time ago, it was created by a people known as the Royal Metateros of the Kashimir. And these people were an ancient race that went extinct in 25,000 BBY when their sun went supernova and destroyed the planet. Basically, Niman is the only thing left of these people, which I think is really interesting about the form. It was an ancient warrior race, and it was originally a dual-bladed style, and it was named after the dual triumvirate of the Kashi deities. The style was adopted by the Legions of Leto, which were basically the very first Dark Jedi, way back when the first Great Schism. A lot of people talk about the second Great Schism, but there was one before that, hence the name. The first Great Schism was the first time that we had really seen Dark Jedi in the galaxy. And they weren't as evil as the Dark Jedi of the Second Great Schism, but they did definitely have their problems, which is why there was a very short war that only lasted a year, and they were called themselves the Legions of Leto. They actually were the first ones to adopt this style, and once they were defeated, Niman was adopted into the Jedi Order, eventually being refined into the sixth form. And way back then, Niman was mostly known for its ability to wield two lightsabers, which brings its history very close to that of Jar Kai, another one we'll talk about here in a minute. I think it's because of that Niman is strongest when it's used with multiple weapons. I don't have proof of this, but I have heard it said before that Grievous was primarily taught Niman by Dooku.
That would make sense. Just giving him a rudimentary understanding of all of the other forms that came before. The thing that I think is interesting about Form 6, man, is that not very many people are very good at it, but like Shi Cho, too, when brought to its ultimate form, if you will, you get people like Exar Kun and Darth Krayt. And
yes,
they're just unstoppable. You know, people like Exar, he never lost a duel. He was stalemated once in a duel. And it's just insane that essentially, if you were to master Form 6, it would mean that you had mastered 5 forms of lightsaber combat to its highest degree. It takes away the idea of just taking pieces of the form, which is what the typical Form 6 user would use. You know, they just have pieces of all of the forms. They haven't really mastered each little intricate part that make up their style. But when you get to people like Kun and Revan and Krayt, they are masters of not only 6, but also 1 through 5, which makes them so dangerous.
Yeah, and when you use a jack of all trades form like that, a true master of it could lean into any of the previous 5 forms they needed to at any given time, making it so versatile. I mean, that's why Sindralig lasted so long against Anakin whenever they were fighting.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine, you know, talking about Grievous too, about his ability to analyze a Jedi's, you know, lightsaber form and then pick in his cybernetic mind what form would best counter that. If you take that and you add the Force, that's when you get people like, you know, Exar Kun, who is able to sense what his opponent is doing and then, you know, counter it, leading into, you know, whatever aspect was required of him in that given moment.
So that is actually the very next thing I wanted to talk about, is another strength of Niman, which is actually the one it's most known for. Because of its relaxed focus on blade work, its strikes are a little bit more simplistic. It actually allowed users to build the habit and the ability of implementing force attacks within their blade work. So you're not just fighting with your lightsaber, but you're able to easily weave in force attacks, which is not as easy as people think it is. People often wonder why the Jedi and Sith don't use the Force more when they're fighting, but Obi-Wan is on record of saying that it's very difficult to do, and many Jedi Masters have studied Niman just for this specific skill.
Wow, to give them the opportunity to, you know, fall back on that if need be. That's incredible. You know, that's something that we discuss more and more. And I've put down a few of the forms during this discussion, but at the end of the day, every single one of them, to its highest degree, to its highest tier, is just a marvel to behold and to discuss, including this one, which is typically a form looked down upon in the lore by the Jedi and Sith. You know, Jedi and Sith are constantly saying, you know, this is the weakest one. If Dooku is one of the biggest critics, I believe in the lore, he said something like, if you practice Form 6, it shows extreme indecisiveness, whereas it's sort of the antithesis of Makashi, if you will. Yeah. 6 and 2 are, you know, very different mindsets. 2 is, you know, this is the form, I will perfect this form, and I will learn its sequences, and that will make me unbeatable in a duel. And 6 is sort of like, I'm going to be a Swiss Army knife. I'm going to, you know, I'm going to go off of what my opponent is offering me. I'm not going to push exactly what my opponent... I'm not going to push my own attacks if my opponent's going to be offensive. And if my opponent's defensive in mind, I can mount an offensive from forms 1 to 5.
It's very reactive in that way. That is very true. Exar Kun would find a balance in this, and he was known for using a lot more aggressive version of Niman, probably leaning more heavily into the Gemso and Ataru aspects of it, I would say. And Revan, also a user of Niman, was very good at mounting his own offense by beginning his attacks with force attacks and then launching into some blade work.
Yeah. I think Revan, unfortunately, he doesn't have a ton of feats.
No.
All we sort of know about him is that he was really good. But when we can point to feats, I'd like to look at people more like Exar Kun, who we can see in the comics and through their writings, just how good he is. There's no other way to put it. He's incredible.
Yeah, it is. That is true. That's unfortunate with a lot of users of Niman, is that because our main guys that we have to point to who are masters of it, Syndralik, Exar Kun, and Revan, they aren't shown. They're just told to us that they're really good. Like, lore-wise.
Yeah, exactly. Syndralik is the big one.
It's all off screen, which is really unfortunate, unlike Darth Krayt.
No, Darth Krayt, he was my favorite character for a really long time, just because I enjoyed how he persisted through the generations, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
He is an Order 66 survivor that cut his way out of Order 66. He didn't really have a massive advantage when it was enacted, and then he eventually would begin to embrace the dark side on Tatooine, where he would lose to Obi-Wan as an Order 66 survivor after he took control of a Tusken clan, because he himself comes from Tusken lineage, where he's not a full, physiologically he's human, but in Legends, Tusken Raiders was more of a culture than anything else. It wasn't like a species per se. And he just persisted. He went through the years. He aided Luke Skywalker in taking down Abeloth. He was a big enemy of Cade Skywalker. To me, Krayt is sort of like the big final boss, and his lightsaber form is really impressive. And he's in this era where he's the leader of the one Sith, and if you read the comics, you get the impression that he's sort of, leagues above everybody else when it comes to the lightsaber form. Cade Skywalker can't really beat him blade to blade, and there's no one really that can challenge Cade or can challenge Krayt, because he is the embodiment of Jar Kai, which is he's so old, he's a master of all the other forms. This is a Sith that has dueled Obi-Wan Kenobi, and now for him to fight, generations of Skywalkers later, he's just legendary. I love him.
That's super awesome, dude. I'm actually going to be starting reading the Legacy comics here soon. I had it in my schedule for today before I got busy, but I'm actually really excited to dig into those.
No, Krayt's great, and it's because of his age, again, and because of his ability to have studied for as long as he could, which Syndralik says you need to study, Niman for as long as you can.
He said
and
10 years.
I sort of attribute 10 years, yeah, and I sort of attribute Darth Krayt's skill to his age as well and his experience.
But as sorry,
go ahead. Sorry, man.
No, I was about to say the problem with Niman though is as good. So far, we have been talking about how absolutely perfect and deadly it is in the hands of a master. But we need to also acknowledge that mastery is the minority. And with Niman, that is even more emphasized. There are very few people who committed to mastering Niman. So when we talk about forms, we really do need to keep in mind the average Joe, the average Jedi that's going to be using these. And in that regard, most Niman users don't take it to its fullest degree, and causing the vast majority of Form 6 practitioners to be just very weak combatants.
Yeah, and because of the simple fact they're not masters, they're novices, and they sacrifice for the first 10 years the ability to mount something truly spectacular, like if they as opposed if they had like mastered Makashi. Instead, they have divided their time trying to learn it all, which makes them not great at any of it.
Yeah, and the problem is that this specific part is one of the reasons why people don't talk about Form 6 as much, is because unlike the other forms, it has a very distinct lack of identity. While not having any glaring weaknesses, it doesn't have any significant strengths either, and that's what makes it actually pretty mid. A Nemon user is...
Mid generally.
Generally speaking, of course. A Nemon user is just far more likely to lose to a true master of any of the other forms.
Right, which is why, it takes a long time, and that's why it almost went extinct during the Clone Wars. Like, people... teaching of it was severely reduced because they got massacred on Geonosis. They couldn't mount an appropriate defense to the battle droids because they were just too thin.
Yeah. I remember
it's tragic.
One Nemon user that it was kind of more of a Joe Schmo was this one Jedi in the Bane novels. I forgot his name. I hate that I forgot his name, but it'll come back to me later today, and I'm gonna get mad about it. But this one Jedi, the way that a lot of Star Wars novels I noticed like to do things is they will split the story between two perspectives. A lot of the Sith novels do this, is they'll do a Jedi perspective and then the main guy that the book is about's perspective. I actually have a lot I want to say about that. I really hate that Star Wars novels do that, but it's fine. So our Jedi protagonist, our Jedi guy in the Bane novels, when we time skip to him several years later, he is a user of Nemon, and he describes his strikes as being very simple and not complex at all. And when he was sent to help the Jedi Strike team take down Darth Bane and Darth Zana, which I have no idea why the Jedi Order thought it was a good idea to have him tag along. It was described that he actually got in the way of one of the other Jedi combatants. One of the other guys used Gem So and had a saber staff, but his simplistic moves actually got in the way of that they got in the way of that Jedi, and Zana was using that against them.
Yeah, I mean, this all goes to the whole idea that if a Jedi didn't know what form they wanted to use, why not just do Form 6? Consulars, individuals that very popular among consulars who have little to no interest in lightsaber dueling and only do it, because they have to have a basic knowledge of it as a Jedi. So it's that mindset of like, this is the form that they didn't really want to pick a form, so they just sort of tried to learn it all. They became wishy-washy, and that's they're weak probably because of their mindset. But my big question that I don't really know if I have an answer to, but I want to know if you do, why do you think the two best practitioners of Form 6 are Sith? Why do you think that is?
I think because Sith have a drive to actually reach that level of perfection and mastery. I think it's because a Jedi uses Nemon because they don't know what they want to pick, or they're trying to pick a style that will suit them for all situations, whereas a Sith chooses Nemon because it's going to facilitate a Sith's cunning, if you know what I mean. Because whereas a Jedi will reactively switch the balance of their style when using Nemon, a Sith will choose the balance of Nemon that's best for dismantling their opponent. It's the analysis, it's the adaption, it's the dismantling.
Yeah, I like how you put that. The idea that a Sith devote themselves to pure mastery of the form, where the Jedi are just complacent in picking one. So, I mean, I don't really have anything else to say about 6. Do you? All right, let's move on to 7. So now, guys, we've reached Form 7, the final of the official 7. After Form 7, we'll go into sort of the more miscellaneous forms, as well as discuss Luke Skywalker and how he approached his forms and the changes that he made to lightsaber combat when it comes to their naming and how he hybridized them. But let's finish off the main 7, of course, Juyo and Vapad. Obviously, we'll start with Juyo first. It is known as the Ferocity form, Form 7, or the way of the Vornsker. And just off recording, we decided to research what a Vornsker was. Essentially, they were a nocturnal canine predator that hunted the Ysalamiri. And if you guys remember, the Ysalamiri is what Thrawn would utilize because they were able to cut people off of the Force organically. So Thrawn, who was always threatened by the Ysalamiri, would keep them around in order to keep people like Jorah Sabaoth at bay, and then later even Luke. But how it applies here is that the Vornsker and the Ysalamiri are natural enemies, essentially. The Vornsker hunts the Ysalamiri, which we have theorized off recording that could indicate that Form 7 would counter that of Form 2. And the more you think about it, the more that becomes a little bit more accurate, because they are counters of one another. One is, if Gemso and Sarisu were the counters for one another, it would make sense that Makashi and Juyo would be the counters. One is very ferocious. It's meant to be randomized with the sole intention of someone drawing upon their own anger and hatred in the Force. Form 7 is one of the abilities that draws the most heavily on the Force. And it would make sense that where Form 2 is more of like refined and elegance, that ferocity would indeed counter that. So, a little interesting tidbit. Form 7, the way of the Vornsker. Juyo is considered a primarily Sith form and is forbidden for the use among most Jedi because its principles violate the Jedi Code. Now, something, and I don't know if you've realized this, Bryce, but there are contradictions in the lore frequently about, like, they will say Form 7 is a form you're not supposed to use, it's forbidden among the Jedi, but then there will be offhanded comments in books where it's like, Yoda, master of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, or, Luke, master of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat. So, although the form is primarily discouraged and forbidden for probably Padawans and maybe even Knights, I think it's a common misconception that it's not practiced in the Jedi Order. I still think it very much is.
It is. Actually, whenever I was doing research for this discussion, I was looking in the book, The Jedi Path, and the Jedi Battlemaster who wrote the chapter about Juyo, he knew of its ways and insinuated that there was a way for Jedi to practice it, but he erred on the side of caution immensely in it.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to handle a form this dangerous with great care because it draws upon emotions like anger, ferocity, being unpredictable, being vicious, being chaotic. Chaos. Chaos is the exact opposite of balance. So for an individual to be balanced as a Jedi, to introduce chaos into their lightsaber form could be catastrophic, especially when you take into account that people were worried that Shi-Cho was too erratic, Form 1. You can only imagine how they would react when a Padawan came up to them and was like, I would like to learn the sequences of Form 7. They're probably like, no, and also now you're on a watch list. Like, that's how I would imagine things would go.
It does go against the Jedi Code. The way that the Battlemaster wrote it was like, he said that one could train in the sequences of Form 7, but you're never going to truly master it unless you actually use your emotion in your form. He talked about something about locking one's emotions away and keeping them under like lock and key and letting them out only in small spurts in order to actually utilize Juyo at its best. But of course, that's not really feasible for Jedi to do. Only select masters are even allowed to study it, I believe.
Do you know about where in the timeline the Battlemaster was that wrote this? Is it pre-Republic era or pre-Republic Classic era?
I believe it was. This book was written by Master Faye Coven, so it seems that this Battlemaster would have been her contemporary. So I would place it somewhere several years after the fall of the Brotherhood of Darkness.
Yeah, so way before the Republic Classic. The reason I ask is because it seems like the Battlemaster of the time is almost a precursor of the thinking like Vapad, locking one's emotions inside, but realizing that they're there. It seems like Mace Windu was far from the first Jedi to have a fascination with Form 7, which is interesting and makes sense.
Yeah, I can see that.
What do you know about the history of Form 7? I know in the other forms we've sort of been able to talk about how they link to one another and what the galaxy is like when each form is made. So do we know anything like to contextualize why 7 was made?
Weirdly, no. I actually, of all the lightsaber forms on this list, Form 7 is the most mysterious. I have not found any history pertaining to when or where or why Juya was even made.
Interesting. We do know it was made by a Sith. That's
Yes.
or a dark side wielder. That goes without question. I'm just trying to think of on the top of my head where like one of the first appearances would be, and one of the main wielders. But what I think is interesting about Juyo or Juya, we say it. I've heard books pronounce it in different ways, So, but it becomes more popular during the Imperial and Republic Classic era. I mean, the practitioners, if you look at them, they're all Republic Classic era. And when I say Republic Classic, that means before the Clone Wars broke out. So we have individuals like Sidious, Maul, Mace Windu, Sora Bulk, all individuals that presumably studied Form 7 in the Republic Classic era. But when we go back in the timeline, it's more and more scarce that we see Form 7. I'm trying to think of an ancient Sith Lord who would have used 7, but I'm drawing a blank. But it appears like maybe in the gap between Bane and Sidious, the form became more popular because forcing the Sith to lie in wait, forcing them to obsess over, the desire to dominate and to butcher a Jedi, we know is something that Sidious ruminated on for decades, and so did Maul. And I think that fascination with not just beating a Jedi, but brutally butchering them could lead to correlation to, the resurgence of Form 7, which I think is interesting, drawing upon one's own dark side to create a form that, will dismantle a Jedi in savage fashion.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I mean, I at least really like that theory. I would say it would have had to have existed sometime during the Brotherhood of Darkness. I just remembered, I had it here, that the Battlemaster's name who talked about the sequences, his name was Scarch Vonk. Fun name, I know. But, he was the one who was like, one could drill in the sequences of Form 7 and commit it to memory, but it's never going to be at its fullest potential until you allowed passion and excitement to enter your blow. So not necessarily ferocity in the most negative form, but he put it, if a Jedi were to use it, more like the excitement of battle. In my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sounds like something a Jedi Sentinel might be able to do.
Yeah, I know that Mace Windu, what really concerned him was his excitement and a love for battle. And I also know that that's why he refused to show Anakin Vapad, because he knew just how much Anakin, loved dueling. But just to go back and maybe correct myself a little bit, I didn't mean to imply that Juyo wasn't around before the Rule of Two. I just meant to imply that perhaps the Rule of Two era is when it was popularized among Sith. I definitely believe that it was around.
Right. Of course. I actually, again, I think I would still agree with you because in that same chapter, Sidious writes in the margins that it is a Sith form, and he is a a big, what do you call it, supporter, proprietor of Form 7. Even someone who doesn't care too much about lightsaber combat, like Sidious, still treats Form 7 as distinctly Sith. He thinks of it definitely as one of their, as a part of Sith heritage to use Form 7.
I would think that Sidious would like the form because of its high emphasis on using the Force to bolster your own, attacks. Because he's so primarily focused on the Force and the gifts of the Force, and he views lightsaber dueling as an afterthought, I think it would make a lot of sense that he would prefer this form. I've also heard in the Plagueis novel, it's just said that Palpatine was a master of all 7 forms, right? But I've also seen people speculate that he used Nyman as well, or Niman, which I think is interesting and I think probably is accurate. I think a lot of that sort of arose after the Mandalore duel, where he was using 2 blades.
Yeah.
I've also heard people describe Sidious as wanting to be made, like in behind the scenes, the choreography saying that the idea behind the way Palpatine fights is that he is a master of all 7 forms, and that's very intentional. But, obviously he uses that information of the other 6 forms, but he falls into the ferocity form, and he uses Juyo pretty clearly.
Yeah, I can see that. I think I can definitely see where the Niman influences have come into his style with him mixing in Force attacks. As we'll get into later, just because someone uses 2 blades, I don't believe indicates that they are a Niman practitioner, even though Niman championed dual wielding. As we know, Darth Maul also uses Juyo and uses a saber staff, and after doing some research, I found out that using a saber staff is actually more akin to Jar-Kai. Apparently, Jar-Kai, the dual-wielding form, isn't limited to 2 separate sabers, but also encompasses saber staff wielding as well.
That is interesting. I just did some quick research on Form 7, and it looks like it was around during the Mandalorian Wars, predominantly wielded by 2 Jedi, Jedi Master Kavar and Jedi Master Zez Kyle. It also says...
The Mandalorian...
Yeah, it also says it was wielded by a Rook Lamar.
Rook Lamar, that sounds familiar. Wait, Master Lamar.
So
wasn't he a member of like that Jedi Council?
I believe so, if I'm not mistaken.
Rook Lamar.
But it's interesting that it cites that's 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, by the way. So it's interesting that during that period that Form 7 would be utilized by Jedi, or at least that in the lore the 3 Jedi are named as being Form 7 wielders, and it's quite shocking that no Sith is previously mentioned to have wielded it. But I think that it just holds more weight to the theory that it was developed and, highlighted more during the Rule of 2. I think that not only now is a theory, but, the likeliest option for, how the form came to prominence.
Well, what's interesting is that the fact that it was brought to prominence, maybe not got its origins, but brought to prominence around the Mandalorian Wars, because that's also around the time that Ataru was cited to have been brought to prominence.
Interesting.
So this is like the Sith Ataru, if you will, with a little bit more added dark side.
Yeah. So do you want to sort of talk about Vapad, or are there some other things? Let's first let's talk about some of the strengths of Form 7.
Yes.
So in your mind, what is like some of the best aspects of a Form 7 practitioner? What do they bring to the table?
I think it should not be understated how absolutely devastating this form is. We've talked about how Jem So is definitely that all-out attack form, and you can't really get better, in the way of offense than Form 5. But there's one thing that Juyo can do that Jem So cannot, And because of its randomness and chaotic blade motions, it has been known to be able to eviscerate the defenses of even a Surisu master.
Interesting. Because the sequences are likely so randomized, and Gemso, while it's offensive-minded, it still probably has set sequences, whereas
it does.
Whereas Juyo is more focused on the randomization and the ferocity, and I could see how that could trick and mess up a Surisu wielder, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about it is it's described as being like a river, constantly flowing and seemingly unconnected moves all coming together to form one stream that is connected. And that just throws off everyone who fights a Juyo practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at rivers, there's no necessary set pattern to any of them, but it still flows in the direction that it's supposed to. So I think that that's an amazing comparison.
And the next thing about it is that its chaotic nature and acrobatics, it functions pretty closely to Ataru, but of course, as we just said, even Ataru has set patterns. It makes it very difficult to fight against. And I think what makes Juyo so strong and why Surisu users have such a difficult time against it is it's actually meant to throw off the force intuition of fellow force-using combatants.
That's super interesting. Yeah, we know that was one of Obi-Wan's greatest gifts was, relying on his force intuition and knowing what to do. But as we discussed in the Form 3 section, Obi-Wan is not a typical Surisu wielder. He's exceptional. And he is exceptional because he allows himself to just completely fall into the Force. But that's not something that's easy to accomplish. And that's only something he was able to accomplish very late in his training as a Jedi Master. But for the typical Surisu practitioner, they're still always going to be a little bit present. And because of that, Form 7 can eviscerate them if they're not extremely careful, because Surisu is so regimented and because it's all about conserving energy and waiting for the right moment. When it comes up against a form that is all about randomization and bringing a massive offensive front from multiple angles with just pure rage and anger, you can see why that could make a Surisu wielder falter very easily. And for that matter, anybody falter very easily. The thing that I find really interesting about the duel between Maul and Qui-Gon, though, is the way that Maul sort of lures Qui-Gon to a position of his choosing where he weakens him, but he also is able to let out his ferocity in the correct moment. And so I think the way that Maul uses Form 7 in the Duel of Naboo is really interesting. Do you have any thoughts on the insight into maybe his approach during that battle and how Form 7 helped him out?
I think Form 7 is definitely the most cunning of all forms. I would say it's even more cunning than Form 2. Because instead of surgically taking your opponent down, it's the idea of using controlled emotion to know when to aggress and when to pull back. Because even though it's a ferocious form, it's not all attack. And we do see Maul and Sidious go on the defensive quite a few times. And it's the way of luring your opponents into exactly where you want them to be and then suddenly exploding with your own counteroffensive, showing your opponent that you've been in control of the duel the entire time. And I think that is a way that Maul in particular likes to fight. We know in lore he's actually has a problem with his ego because of this. He feels like he can outsmart just about any combatant he comes up against and outskill them as well.
Right. And he plays with his food.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So unlike a Surisu wielder who is, saving up their force reserves for one big strike, a Juyo wielder always has that energy ready to go, but they're just waiting for the perfect time to, let everything boil over. And for them, it's likely at that point not one blow, but a sequence of unconnected attacks, right?
I think it's more like it's, and this is gonna sound super philosophical and monkey, but just like hear me out. It's like the currents of an ocean washing ashore. It'll aggress and then recede, and then it'll just do that over and over again. Pushing the opponent's buttons until it can suddenly overwhelm them. You can see in the fight between Palpatine and Windu, they kind of change positions of who's aggressing and who's defending. But Palpatine will be defending for a little bit, and he'll be conservative with his movements, and then all of a sudden he'll just explode with a random acrobatic trick to throw off Windu, and then get right back to it.
That's true. That's very interesting as well. So I guess the thing about Form 7 is it still is more complex than most people give it credit for initially.
Oh yeah, I think it's probably the most complex form out of all 7 forms, because where most of the forms you can definitely nail down, okay, this is how they work, this is what you can expect from a practitioner of them. Juyo just doesn't do that. Form 7 is literally, you have to expect the unexpected, and you still will probably be caught lacking.
Right. Fascinating. So with all of that said, now that we've built it up, just like we built up all the other forms, some of the weaknesses, you wrote here, its aggressive motions leave windows and openings for counterattacks, opportunities to attack when faced with multiple opponents. So when someone is so offensive-minded in a second, that is saying that it leaves small openings for individuals to get past that and to exploit that. And, again, we talk about Obi-Wan, but Obi-Wan is the individual that fights Maul the most by far. And we can typically see in those duels, it's not like Obi-Wan mounts some incredible offensive maneuver that defeats Maul. It's that he sees that small opening that is afforded to him because of the sheer ferocity, and he capitalizes on that small opening.
Because of Juyo's sharp and chaotic movements. Okay, so we built up about how wildness and randomness and the chaotic movements work in the practitioner's favor of being able to throw off the senses of an opponent and all that good stuff. But there's something to be said about reliable blade work and sequences, which is that very fact. They're reliable. It provides a good, even amount of, okay, my flanks are going to be covered when I make this motion and all that good stuff. Unfortunately, Juyo is trading that reliability for that unpredictability. And because of that, it does leave those windows in your defenses when you explode into your movement. So while an opponent may not need to, detect or they may not need to be able to defend against each individual stroke of the blade, they should at least be able to detect when the Juyo practitioner is about to attack, and they can be prepared to intercept it.
Interesting. I think a good example of that would be the duel on Mandalore, right? Where Palpatine and Maul are both Form 7 wielders, and Maul, even, we made a video about it, he attempts to adopt a Sarisu style in the very beginning of the duel because he likely knows that skill to skill, his master will beat him. But as the duel progresses, Maul very much goes into Form 7 versus Form 7, and because he's not as skilled, and because he lacks that ability to intercept his master at the correct point in time, where, in contrast, someone like Yoda likely would be able to intercept something that Sidious mounts as an offensive front, Maul sort of falls short.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's kind of... It unfortunately has the reverse effect, where the way more powerful and experienced Palpatine excuse me, can detect those moments in Maul's form and is able to pick him apart instead.
Right. Interesting.
I think the part about Juyo that makes it more interesting than almost any of the other forms is that it's not all blade work either. Most of the time when people talk about this form, they talk about what goes on behind the scenes in the Force.
Yeah, building up that rage and letting it control you, essentially. That probably leads into the randomness of the form. is partially controlled by your rage and anger, where again with Sarisu, your being balanced is also pulling upon the Force. It's not necessarily a set form, and they're allowed to counter and to defend very accurately, where this is sort of the offensive coin of that.
Yeah, it's like, but the thing about Juyo is that it creates a current, a cycle. It's ideal for Sith because their darkness feeds into the power of Juyo, and which in turn, the specific blade sequences and wildness of the form will feed back into that darkness. And it creates this loop of power where physical stamina almost isn't even necessary.
Interesting. Yeah, I've described it as a superconductive loop within oneself. And now that you've brought that up, I think we should transition into Vapad or Vapad.
I agree.
And sort of explain how that's different and how Mace Windu and others have utilized that superconductive loop using famously not their own inner hatred and their own inner darkness, but by siphoning the darkness and the energy from your opponent that essentially is forcing your opponent to fight themselves endlessly.
Love it.
So something that I want to talk about with Vapad is that it's not a form that is achieved very easily at all. It's the most difficult form to achieve perfectly on this list by far. So much so that Mace Windu has only fallen into it once or twice in his entire life. And one of the major reasons for that is because when he dueled Palpatine, he's dueling this pure evil entity of the dark side itself. And because they are so pure and because he is so evil, he is able to form that loop, form that connection with the darkness far more easily than he ever could against somebody like, Maul or heaven forbid Dooku. It just wouldn't work anywhere near as effective. Because Palpatine is all rage, all fury, it sort of works against him. Where if Dooku were to duel Windu and Windu was trying to use Vapad perfectly, the loop wouldn't be able to form because Dooku's more reserved. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about. Is it's a misconception that it's like the other forms where, there are set sequences to it, and if you do those sequences, you achieve it. It's just like its brother in Juyo in the fact that you need to form that loop in the Force in order to achieve it.
Yeah, I would agree to a certain point. I think it's one of those things where it works in varying degrees because it's like reflecting a blaster bolt, and it's about reflecting an opponent's darkness back on them. So if they have any darkness at all, they're going to feel that. And I think it achieves it was at its strongest and achieves its perfection against Sidious. I do think it would work against Dooku, however, because Dooku, even if he doesn't express that darkness like some other Sith do in combat, it's still there within him, so it's still going to be used against him.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see it being used, just nowhere near the effectiveness and the near perfection that it was against Palpatine.
Agreed. Yeah, I'll agree to that.
And I think that the lack of Vapad to its best degree, Dooku could capitalize on it. Perhaps. That's a big debate. Windu versus Dooku is a huge debate.
It is. I know Dooku actually had a lot of criticism towards Windu's form. He thinks that Vapad is sloppy. But of course, that's just sort of that randomness that comes with Form 7, really.
Yeah. And it being, Mach Shi is about refinement and elegance and precision. It would make sense that randomness would drive Dooku crazy. One of the biggest weaknesses for Vapad is those that try to use it, they experience a pull to the dark side of the Force so intense and so strong that it threatens to pull them not only to the dark side, but to Juyo. Mace Windu in the comics, when Sora Bulk attempts to use Vapad against him, says that it's not Vapad or Vapad, that it is now just Juyo, and that it is just the ferocity form, and that he has lost that mindset. which I think is interesting. Same thing happens with Depa Balaba. All the
Right.
individuals,
I was about to bring up Depa.
the individuals that practice Vapad are pulled to the dark side of the Force more than any other form, bar Form 7 itself. More individuals that practice it are pulled to the dark side on unprecedented levels. And Mace Windu, it's maybe Mace Windu and Luke would be the only two people that have really been able to use it and not turn to the dark side. And Luke using Form 7 doesn't come from an official source. It just comes from, what's the author's name?
Mm-hmm.
I'm drawing a blank.
It was, shoot, I can't remember his name either. Timothy Zahn, that's who it was.
Right. Someone at a fan expo was reading a section of one of the Thrawn novels, and they asked him if in that section he was meaning to imply that Luke was using Vapad. And Timothy Zahn said that wasn't his intention when he wrote that, but that he likes that explanation a great deal. So it's sort of up to us now whether we think that Luke, learned of the form and can use it. My headcanon is that he can.
I was about to say, I like to think that he could.
But it's never outright said. But what I do want to, hit home is that it's essentially Mace Windu and Luke, and those are the only two.
Yeah, pretty much. In my opinion, it's a good thing that Anakin didn't never learn Vapad. I think he would have fallen to the dark side much faster.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, individuals, there's the famous moment in the comic where Quinlan Voss tries to use it in a sparring session with Windu, and Windu breaks off the session and is like, never use that ever again. Because Windu in Form 7 is like the ultimate gatekeeper, and he's only going to teach it to people that he's confident in completely. And the only reason Sora Bulk knew sequences is because he and Windu developed it together.
Right.
It wasn't like
exactly. And of course,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, my bad. I was about to say, and of course, Sora Bulk would end up using that to kill several Jedi, including Oppo Rancisis.
Yeah. But when Windu said it, he said that he had lost track of what it meant to use Vapad, and that he was just using Juyo.
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah.
Which just shows that line. But just to nail home what everyone talks about with Vapad, it siphons your enemy's aggression out of them, flows through you without touching your own heart, and without the darkness affecting you, and you are able to connect that current of darkness back onto your enemy, and it forms, like I said, a superconductive loop of power to the point where an enemy is fighting themselves against their own darkness, essentially, which is why it was so massively effective against Sidious.
I, as an aside, love that idea because we know how much Mace Windu absolutely hated the darkness, hated Sith, and in the Book of Sith, he had a lot of criticisms to lay down, and one of those was that the dark side is a torch which burns bright but quickly burns out. And that quote by Mace Windu shows us just how much he despises the dark side. So he would create a form that literally shoves it in the Sith's face why using emotion was such a bad idea.
Yeah, in an attempt to burn them out.
Mm-hmm.
And, once they're burned out, it's essentially easy pickings for the Jedi Master. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about with it before we get into the weaknesses, and that is that on one occasion when Windu was dueling Grievous, Windu saw Grievous use portions of Form 7, and he decided to break off the engagement, and from that point on, he refused to ever duel Grievous again because he was afraid what would happen if he learned the sequences. What's your sort of take on that?
It is curious that that would happen because, as we know, what's his name? Skarchvonk, what he said about Form 7 is that it's not just the sequences, but what you do in the Force and the mindset. And of course, I guess, Windu was afraid that because Grievous was so aggressive, he could pretty much put together his own form of Juyo, which, even if you're not using the Force, that can still, as we talked about earlier, just the blade sequences can still take down experienced Surisu practitioners who were the only ones who stood a chance against Grievous at the time.
Yeah. I guess the answer to it in part is, you can use it if you have your own aggressive feelings and your hatred at the surface. But also the truth of it is that Windu didn't want to find out what that would look like, in the first place, which is why he broke it off.
Yeah, I would agree. I couldn't imagine General Grievous using Juyo.
No. So now that we've talked about 7 and pretty much completed all of the basic forms 1 through 7, I don't have any closing thoughts on 7. Do you?
Neither do I, sir.
All right, I'll let you go ahead and explain what you wrote in the discussion notes as a Form 0, and go
yes.
from there. Sort of the other forms of lightsaber combat that aren't defined numerically.
Correct. So in this next section, we're going to be talking about these lightsaber forms, and I put forms very loosely. When we say forms, they're not really defined systems like the forms 1 through 7. They're actually more like just different sets of techniques which are utilized by the Jedi and by the Sith. Usually the Jedi more often. But Form 0 is more of a nickname to this, and it's actually just a way of nonviolence. If you ever go to a martial arts school or anything, the first thing they teach you is that violence is never the answer, and you should never hit first. It's more like you want to try to talk down your opponent before violence even happens. And that's pretty much Form 0. It's ethnic principles of knowing when and when not to use a lightsaber in the first place. This is that moment that you see where Jedi will kind of pull their cloak back and let their lightsaber be very plainly seen by whoever's starting to cause trouble. It's less of a threat and more like an establishment of power. And it's just a way of being like, now look, I have a lightsaber. I know how to use it. I don't want to use it. So let's see if we can find a peaceful solution to this.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind for me is just recently in Tales of the Jedi where where Dooku unlatches his lightsaber from his belt and he places it on the table, if you remember that.
Mm-hmm. Form 0.
The way of maybe not interpreting that as a threat, but a show of what one is capable of in an attempt to disarm a situation, just like you explained. And it makes sense.
I mean,
go ahead.
No, my bad. I was about to say, and you can make that, you can figure that out whenever Dooku says, let me make my intentions clear. And then he puts the lightsaber on the table.
Right.
That's pretty much all you need to know.
Yeah, that is all you need to know. You wrote it's endorsed heavily by Yoda, Kyle Katarn, and Luke, and that it is very boring.
I mean, it's boring.
Yeah, it definitely is. But it is good that, two of the best grandmasters are huge proponents of it. Another moment where you could say that this is implemented that I really love is in the first ever episode of the Clone Wars, where Ventress goes to strike down. Is it a Trandoshan? Is that where they're fighting? Not a Trandoshan.
No, it's a Tordarian.
Yes.
King Katuku, I believe. I watched that episode recently.
Yeah, when Yoda rips Ventress's lightsabers out of her hands and admires them and then gives them back.
That moment is so cold. And it's not just the fact that he overpowers her in the Force casually by taking her lightsabers. It's the fact that she's such a little threat to him that he gives them back. I always thought that was so disrespectful.
Yeah, no, but that's such a good Yoda moment. Oh my gosh. Yoda embodies
It
this
is.
philosophy more than anyone else. We give Yoda a lot of crap for all the mistakes he made, but obviously he was a consular through and through, and drawing upon his lightsaber was oftentimes the last resort. So,
Right.
let's move on to something a little more
let's go
cool.
ahead. Yes. So one thing we have been talking repeatedly about in this video is Jar-Kai, the art of dual wielding. This one's definitely a long time coming, and many people refer to this as Form 8, but that's more of an unofficial classification because, well, it's more of like a subtype of every lightsaber form and not much of a form in and of itself. Even though it can be used as its own form, it's not really common because the original form that Jar-Kai was based off of is outdated. It was actually not developed by the Jedi, much like Niman, which, we talk about Niman being good with dual wielding. That's because Jar-Kai complements Niman very much. They come from similar origins is the reason. They were developed by a people known as the Yavshin swordsmen, and it was actually named after a city on their planet of Atricia. So Jar-Kai was actually a city where these swordsmen trained.
Interesting. So I've always heard it described as a variant of Niman, but you very clearly have said no, it's not a variant of Form 6. The two just complement each other well because Form 6 is so versatile.
Right.
So
That's correct.
You have said that Jar-Kai can sort of be adopted into any of the forms of lightsaber combat. It is just the art of dual wielding a lightsaber.
It is, because dual wielding swords and dual wielding lightsabers are two very different matters, as we know.
Yeah.
Dual wielding lightsabers is very dangerous. It's so dangerous because whenever you're using a lightsaber, most Jedi have to use their intuition to know exactly where their blade is and where it's about to be. But with Jar-Kai, you're having to learn how to split your attention within the Force to both of your lightsabers. And that requires an entire system of techniques that you have to learn.
Yeah. But if you do learn those, you can become extremely formidable. Darth Krayt, who you've been reading about recently. What do you think of him so far? Because that's one of my favorite Sith Lords.
Oh man, he's big man on campus right now.
No, he is.
I actually really enjoy watching him move around. I mean, this guy knows who he is, and everyone around him knows who he is. I just recently read in a comic when he casually dispatched 4 Imperial Knights. Honestly, the more I read into the Legacy comics, the more I'd love to start doing more videos about them sometime soon.
Yeah, so we'll be highlighting characters like Krayt and Cade on the channel as time goes on.
Nice.
So look forward to that. But Krayt, he's a Jar-Kai wielder, and he may have been a variant of Form 7 Jar-Kai and 6. That's sort of how I've interpreted him, because he's so versatile. And what's also interesting about Krayt is that he has dual-wielded lightsabers for some time. It's not something that he just adopted as a Sith Lord. It's something that he used as a Jedi Master as well. So
that's really cool.
What else? Do we want to move on to Trakata? I'll let you explain that as well.
Yes. One of the most infamous lightsaber forms. There will be many here who will either get excited or sneer at the words Trakata. So this is the art of taking advantage of a lightsaber's ability to switch on and off. And they use that during combat. And this is the way of being able to trick an opponent by slipping their guard or unbalancing them. You get into a saber lock, you just turn off your lightsaber, sidestep, turn it back on when you have the emitter pointed right at their neck or their side. And so this was ironically, even though it's really cunning and deadly, it was created by a Jedi consular sometime during the Great Galactic War. And it wasn't that before then, the Jedi and Sith never thought, hey, why don't we just use our lightsaber's ability to turn on and off? It's just that it wasn't used because it was really looked down upon by both the Jedi and the Sith. The Jedi saw it as being very unsportsmanlike, which is, that's pretty much on brand for Jedi. They would never use this trick in a combat situation, which is weird that a consular would have made this.
Yeah, that's a weird piece of lore that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I have no idea.
I don't even think there's much explanation from that. I just think that that's a piece of lore where it's like, by the way, this was made by a consular. And it's like, what?
Yeah. I always had canon that this consular got into a fight where he was way in over his head and then used Trickata by accident and went, oh, wow, this works. And then just decided to start doing it all the time.
Maybe. He was probably not popular.
No, and what kind of cracks me up is that the Sith don't use it either, even though you would think that this is perfect for Sith, like treachery and tricks are kind of their way, but they actually saw it as a cheap trick, and it showed weakness to use it.
Yeah, I think back to Darth Maul in one of the books that I was reading recently where in the Battle of Naboo, he talks about when he kicks Obi-Wan off of the platform, he hopes that Obi-Wan lives because he thinks of that as sort of a cheap way to kill a Jedi. So it's sort of the same thing.
Right. I mean, people want to think that Sith are all cunning, but of course they're each one is different. And there's a lot of Sith like Maul that have a sort of warrior's honor in a way.
I'd just call it ego, man. I wouldn't call it honor.
I don't know. Well, it really depends, because there are some Sith who, and I put honor loosely, not as in like they uphold it as a moral code, but more like, I guess you could call it ego. They don't want to feel like they killed someone because they weren't strong enough to defeat them. They want to beat someone in a fair fight to prove their strength.
Yeah, doesn't Bane say honor is for the dead?
Yes, Bane did not believe in honor.
So, I would call it more ego than honor. Like
I mean
a desire to prove one's superiority.
If I'm being quite honest, and this is entirely subjective, I really don't like Trickata at all, and I join both the Jedi and Sith in saying it's cheap, and I don't think that someone should use something just because it works.
Interesting. I'm open to it, because it's just slimy enough to make me hate a villain very quickly,
That's true.
And I could see someone, like a sniveling Sith apprentice or an acolyte use this against, a prominent Jedi master and have an audience turn on him like that.
No, I would be all about that. I guess what I meant was I've had conversations or I've seen people talk about why Jedi and Sith don't use Trickata more often, or that they think that they were like, if I had a lightsaber, I'd be, doing that all the time. And, it just doesn't make sense that they don't do that. And I'm like, it does make sense that they don't do that because it sucks.
Yeah. And also you wrote for the weakness, which is super valid, that when your lightsaber is off, that you are open. You are super vulnerable. The only real thing you can do is maybe try to turn it on as quickly as possible and get in the right positioning, or, dodge with your body. But, you are open and it is dangerous. It's not like this is some ultimate cheat code. It's a major risk on behalf of anyone that tries to utilize it. So it's just a bad idea all around, frankly.
Yeah, it's unexpected, and you might be able to get it off once or twice, but if you're up against an experienced opponent, they're going to be able to intuit through the Force if you're about to do that. That's probably why Bane, who didn't believe in honor, didn't do this, because if you shut off your lightsaber, you are wide open to any and every kind of attack.
Yeah, and we know Bane, was very focused on defense as well, so that would go against pretty much that. So I can absolutely see why it's hated.
Yeah, he was focused on self-preservation, and this is one of those sort of, I guess you might call it a high risk, high reward, but I like what you said. It's just a bad idea.
Yeah. Moving on. Trispossessed.
Right.
I have never heard of this.
Neither did I before. So while I was doing research, writing out this, I was like, okay, well, I know about Tricata. I know about Form Zero. I wonder if there are any other hidden lightsaber forms, you might call them. And I came across Trispossessed. That's hard to say. So it is the way of aerial combat for Jedi who have the ability to fly. And of course, this isn't the like force flight or anything like that. This is about Jedi or force users who are naturally born as a species with wings. It was developed by the Skytree race, which are winged humanoids. And it's sort of like a mutation of Ataru, which has been mixed with traditional Skytree aerial combat. And they were a race of people who championed themselves on being able to fly during combat. And they actually, like, this is a pretty hilarious piece of lore, they looked down on people who were down on the ground, and they called them walkers as a derogatory term. I'm like, okay.
Man, this is one of those times where Star Wars even goes too far.
I'm like, okay, just racist against someone because they can walk. That's fine, I guess.
Yeah, you also wrote here, huge focus on Sai Cha decapitating an opponent. So this is a sub form developed by a Jedi, right?
It is not said who it was developed by, but it seems like this seems like something that would have been developed by a Sith.
Yeah.
Someone who could fly and look down on opponents that couldn't. The first time we actually see this form used is by a dark Jedi who Kyle Katarn fought. I don't know her name, but she was a Skytree.
Interesting. So it probably is a form, maybe even developed by a dark Jedi, maybe not even a Sith. So,
possibly.
So what is a Jedi's view on decapitation? Are they for it or against it? Because it is a quick way to end an engagement. And, Mace Windu decapitated Jango Fett, but are they pro that or against it?
Mm-hmm. It is a complicated topic. I remember... I wish I could really quickly bring up the passage in the Jedi Path about it, but we don't really have time for that. I remember basically the gist of it being that it's an unfortunate way for a Jedi to end a conflict, as it's not very respectful to the opponent, and it is pretty brutal. They don't outright forbid it the way that they do like Saitak, and they don't look down on it necessarily like Moki, but it's just not something they try to go for. They're like, avoid this at all costs unless there's just like no other way to end a conflict.
Yeah, unless, the best bounty hunter in the galaxy is right in front of you, then it's probably okay.
Yeah,
I was reading
okay.
in the Attack of the Clones novelization, I found it really interesting that when Jango Fett is attacking Mace Windu, right after he decapitates Jango, goes to block another blaster bolt because he thinks that Jango is just that good. And it doesn't register to him that he's dead yet. So he goes to, like, block another attack. And I always thought that was huge props to Jango Fett.
That's crazy that Dooku was just fighting, barely aware of the movements he was making, and was ready to block a blaster bolt after relieving this man of his head. That's crazy. Who did I say?
You said Dooku.
Dooku. My bad. I meant Windu.
Yeah, we've been talking about Dooku a ton. We always do. We're Dooku fans. Like, massive Dooku fans.
I really am. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Mounted combat. What is that?
Yeah, well, what I was about to say before that, Trip's Zest has a distinct weakness, which it feels a little weird. It's weak to attacks made from directly below the user in their blind spot, which is left open whenever they're attacking.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the last thing I wanted to say about Tripsest.
Yeah, that's definitely the weirdest one I think we'll discuss. Hopefully, I don't know. I haven't researched these other ones. This is a lot of this is new, but I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's like I remember Kyle Katarn defeated the Skytree Dark Jedi by crouching down really low, waiting for her to attack, and right when she passed over him, he like lunged like upward sharply with his lightsaber and caught her, I think, like right in the midsection or something like that.
It makes sense. Interesting. Yeah, don't mess with Kyle Katarn, for real.
Right. So, mounted combat.
One-handed way of fighting.
Pretty much. Yep, self-explanatory.
On a mount, speeder or beast, you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
The user would have a height advantage over the opponent, which obviously makes sense. This is a style of combat that has been used to no end in our own world, which is why it's interesting. Opponents attacked while mounted typically consisted of low lunges, diagonal slashes, and arcs. The style was debatably useful since the duelist would have to split their attention between fighting and controlling a mount. And you wrote pretty mid at the end.
I mean, it is because the problem is when you watch a Jedi on a mount, the movements they're making doesn't seem like that it's its own system of combat. It looks like that they're on top of something and the only thing they can think to do is just to kind of swing their lightsaber around.
Yeah.
And it's not very impressive to watch.
No, there's no real like form that you can apply to it. I mean, obviously you reach down and cleave with the lightsaber or deflect blaster bolts. It's not really...
Yeah.
I mean, to even call that a sub form is a stretch. So,
yeah, it's more like just something that was mentioned that Jedi can do. And then these last two are pretty short. SOCON, which is not entirely a form, but rather a system of techniques in which a Jedi utilizes every part of their environment. And it's sort of the way of turning one's surroundings against the opponent so that the area fights for them, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That would seem more of like a force technique than a lightsaber form.
So it's not entirely about using the force to manipulate the environment telekinetically, but it's more like bobbing and weaving to get behind cover, get on top of high ground, for example, as Obi-Wan did, or utilizing environmental hazards like trying to maneuver your opponent in front of a pit and then force pushing or kicking them into it.
Interesting. I didn't know that had like a term to it.
I didn't either. I guess it's kind of like done mock, where you're like, well, you're just kind of insulting your opponent. You're like, actually, well, yes, but actually, no.
Yeah, and I guess you pointed out Obi-Wan being very good at it, but so was Anakin. And this is this is something that I think couldn't just be solely attributed to when someone's dueling with a lightsaber, but maybe someone's approach to a battle in general. If you remember in the Clone Wars, Ahsoka, she's on the big walker and she's like, we're about to overtake the enemy. And Anakin makes the comment that you were already defeated. You just didn't see it. And that's him using SOCAN as well. So interesting that there's a term for that.
Yeah, it is. I think it's, I would love to think of it as a way of a Jedi being able to sense their environment and know the perfect way of positioning. If you know what I mean.
Yeah. And I mean, another person that was great at that would be, Vader. Vader used his environment to great effect when he would duel Jedi. He would fling, pieces of machinery. He would fling trees at them, distract them, which is actually in the lore something really difficult to do, to telekinetically attack people with debris and also duel at the same time is not an easy thing for someone to accomplish. And Vader was known for it.
And another interesting thing is he utilizes SOCON perfectly, actually, in the duel against Luke and Bespin, whenever Luke kicks him off the carbon freezing chamber platform, and then it seems like Vader just disappears like a ninja, and Luke has to go looking for him through the tunnels, and he just like can't find him. That's him using SOCON. He hid in his environment and then popped out to jump scare Luke later on.
Yeah. I remember reading that like he turned off all of his like life support systems momentarily so he would be silent.
That's really cool.
Moving on, Lus Ma. What is that? Or Lus Ma?
Lus Ma, and there's literally next to nothing about this form that's known at all, except it is apparently a system of techniques that are meant to be able to counter Cerisu's defenses.
Okay.
And it's only mentioned in passing when Dooku was training Grievous in the novel Labyrinth of Evil. And it was given a passing mention, and literally no details exist about it. I just thought I would mention it to make this list more comprehensive.
Dooku gives no explanation. It's just a passing one line.
He was talking about how different forms can counter each other, like how we were talking about earlier, like the rock, paper, scissors. And in the list, when he was kind of listing off examples, he was like something countered by something, Lus Ma to counter Cerisu, and then he moves on to something else. And literally that's it.
So if you had to guess, if you had to hypothesize what would counter Cerisu, a technique, what would you think?
That's so hard because the thing about lightsaber techniques is it's possibly endless.
Yeah.
I would love to think that it incorporates some sort of random, like some sort of way of deceiving a Cerisu user's defenses that something that Juyo probably does. Like maybe like quickly attacking the same place more than 2 or 3 times in a single sequence to kind of throw them off. I'm not really sure.
Interesting. I wish we knew more, but I mean we can't present non-existent material.
Yeah, again, this was one of those where I was like, okay, I'm going to put this in because it's a cool little tidbit of lore, and I want to make sure our list is fully comprehensive. I don't want to leave any stragglers.
Yeah, that's impressive, man. I mean, that you would even find that. That's awesome. Let's go ahead and I'm going to let you finish it off, and I'll interject here and there, but what is the evolution of lightsaber combat once Luke is Grandmaster? How does he change it, and what does it become?
What's interesting with what Luke does to lightsaber combat is, with everything we've mentioned, he decided to take individual pieces of the forms and combine them into 3 styles. So instead of there being 7 distinct forms from which to choose, he decided to take different aspects of the forms, condense them down, and basically min-max their strengths. And this was also done because he didn't exactly have a lot of information about them. There weren't that many holocrons that existed at that time. And of course, he just kind of found whatever he could. And this is Legends. In canon, we know that, what's her name? The Jedi librarian, Jocasta, she leaves a huge trove of holocrons and knowledge that Luke ends up finding later on. But in Legends, no such trove of knowledge exists, and Luke kind of had to piece together what he could from the journals of Obi-Wan Kenobi and what he could find in the Jedi temples.
So when Luke develops the strong style, the fast style, and the medium style, he's forced to work from the ground up at that point. Instead, where in canon, the forms likely would still apply to Luke's Jedi Order.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, I would say so.
But I would
so
also
basically,
say, real quick, that I would guess that Luke also learned about the forms as time went on, and that these were sort of his placeholders. Because I remember hearing that through the Jedi archives, Luke's new order was able to obtain information on Juyo and Vapad. So he would eventually gain an understanding of the forms, but I would sort of interpret this of meshing all of the forms, hybridizing them, but also working with what he had at the time.
Right, and it was a good way of introducing his new Jedi into lightsaber forms that were not only effective but reliable, because this was a period in the galaxy where there weren't a lot of lightsaber users in general. So keeping things strictly to either dueling or to blast deflection wasn't viable, and he wanted to create styles to make his Jedi what's the right word?
Versatile?
The more more present in the galaxy, I would say, where there's a place for them in the new era.
Interesting.
So, starting off, we'll go ahead and talk about strong style first. And it was sort of a hybrid I picked up of Gemso and Shicho, with the added benefit of being able to move towards opponent quickly and cover more ground. It's characterized by large, powerful swings meant to just bust open an opponent's guard and to win saber locks by just shoving their lightsaber to the side. This is Gemso's brute force taken to the nth degree, basically.
Sounds like
it's very strong.
Sounds like Balin.
Yeah, it's. I could definitely see Balin as being a good characterization of what strong style would look like in combat. It's very powerful in 1v1 duels, but weak when facing blaster fire, interestingly, since it's almost exclusively focused on offense, and those wide saber swings don't really make for good, blast deflection, unless you're just kind of like batting them aside like baseballs.
Yeah. It sounds exactly like Balin, man.
Yeah, except he had a really nice, tight defense whenever he was... That's his only thing. That's why I think he was just a beautiful Form 5 user.
Dude, Balin's so cool.
I know, dude. I would love to talk about him more.
Yeah, Ray Stevenson did such an amazing job. I don't mean to sidetrack you. I just think that any opportunity...
No, may he rest in peace.
Any opportunity we get to talk about that performance and that character,
Mm-hmm.
It's so unfortunate, but I'm so grateful that we got it.
Me too. This is not a sidetrack. May he rest in peace. I loved Ray Stevenson in that role, and I don't know how or who they could possibly get to take the role as Balin.
No, it's going to be tough, but, Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, so on to the weaknesses of strong style. Not only was it sort of weak to blaster fire, but it, much like Gemso, it sacrifices speed for unrivaled power. But unlike Gemso, it did not slow them down on the field. So basically they could move quickly and cover more distance, but once they got there, their actual swing speed was much lower, and it left them wide open for counterattacks.
Really interesting. So even these hybridized forms that Luke developed had key weaknesses that could be used against them.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the fact that since he didn't have holocrons that were like, okay, so here's are the distinct sequences of like Form 5 and stuff, he kind of had to do his best with what he ascertained from their philosophies. So he was like, okay, well, you're going to want to reach back and go for a big wide swing here for a big buster move, so...
Big buster move. So let's move on to fast style.
Sure. Fast style. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, combined Ataru and Sarisu created a style that was extremely quick, fast-paced, utilized a lot of force speed. It gave wielders the ability to have a really strong defense while also chaining light jabs and slashes into nearly indefinite combos. I just had a stroke. Strong against blaster users, multiple enemies. Slower opponents. Slower. Was good against multiple enemies, slower opponents, and in 1v1 confrontations. So this is the opposite of strong style. The pairing of Ataru and Sarisu is interesting. I would, if I were around and I was one of Luke's Jedi, I would be like, Ataru and Sarisu, I don't think that those two fit as perfectly as you would think, Grandmaster. So, again, there are weaknesses here. But it is interesting that its foundation was built on the defensive style of Surisu, but with attacking as quickly as possible when given an opening. So it's not the way of Surisu where you sort of charge up for these big openings. It sounds like you're constantly prodding an opponent's defense. Like you would have a shield and you would jab with a spear and then lift up your shield. Sounds a lot like that.
Yeah, it was kind of the way of getting in quick, overwhelming your opponents with like a quick defensive whirl before going into an offensive flurry. And it was like a lot of rapid light strikes. So you're not trying to break your opponent like you would in strong style, but it's more like wearing them down and death by 1,000 paper cuts type thing.
Interesting. But different than the death of 1,000 cuts with Makashi, because that one is more refined and about like capitalizing on openings, not necessarily prodding an opponent.
Right.
The weaknesses, it was very reliant on multiple attacks since the light attacks didn't have much power behind them. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. Guards could be easily broken by a stronger opponent. That sounds like a huge weakness, personally.
It's one of those, I would say it's one of those things where it's funny because it's good against slower opponents in 1v1 confrontations, like someone using strong style, but if that strong style user actually lands their blow, it'll just break open the fast style user's defense like a can of tuna.
Interesting. Very short ranged, bad if there were multiple opponents, and it tired users out very quickly.
Yeah, it's like it was good against multiple opponents, but if they were like more spread out in the room, it was bad. It's a little weird, but if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah. I just think that doesn't sound like that great of a form, personally.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like you're super into fast style.
No, but I think that, again, Luke established these forms as a way to compensate for not having knowledge of the seven. And I think we should also point out that in Out of Universe, these were all written before the forms were given like concrete details. So that's the explanation for it. True. And I just, because it can be kind of confusing because it feels like we're sort of working backwards in Universe, where it's like Luke should have learned more about the forms, not less. But we have to address that all of these books were written before people came in and gave established forms and sequences to characters and in the lore. And that is why it feels a little bit disjointed, if that makes sense.
I believe that the three styles were created for the Jedi Academy video game, but I think I'm wrong about that. I'm not sure.
Interesting. So what Bryce has done is he was essentially forced to work backwards. He's forced to look at these forms and to attempt to add new lore to old lore. So that's why it's a little bit disjointed, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. So just finishing off...
go ahead.
Sorry,
I'll let you take the last one.
Yeah, so finishing it off with medium style. So this was the best equilibrium between speed and strength, and it was pretty much the new Niman, a reliable form to fall back on whenever nothing else works. This one wasn't so much of a hybridized style of any previous set form, but rather just some simple techniques that Luke thought up that was, it provided a respectable balance between offense and defense. It was simple, but effective. And it was a great starting point and foundation from which to add more complex forms or techniques, if you kind of get what I'm saying.
Yeah. Just like Niman is, the jack of all trades, this sounds like it has a little bit of Shicho, where it's like the building blocks. Maybe not necessarily the sequences of Shicho, but the mindset behind it being the foundation of which to grow upon.
Yeah, in my opinion, it doesn't sound like it's something that is meant to be used in and of itself. It's meant to be developed. And I say that because its weaknesses are pretty glaring. It could hold most blaster wielders and weaker duelists at bay, but a sharpshooter like Boba Fett, someone who, knows exactly where to place their shots, or a far more skilled duelist could penetrate medium style's defenses pretty quickly.
And you also wrote a much stronger opponent could break medium style's offense and destroy its momentum, leaving the user open for attack.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this goes into the fact
Right.
that that was a basic form that Luke used as an introduction to lightsaber combat.
Correct.
So there we have it, guys. Before we sign off officially, very briefly, I just want to talk about what our favorite form is, and if we were thrown into the universe and the mythos, what form we would use. And I'll go first if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have always loved Darth Bane's approach to lightsaber combat. The older Darth Bane, where he was forced to adapt being removed from the Orbalist armor. And we talked about this far earlier on in the video, but I have always been fascinated with the idea that Bane's style essentially is if Anakin and Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith had a hybridized style in itself. His ability to fall back on his defense and not have a single drop of water hit him in a storm, where at the same time using overwhelming offense, I think that, his curved lightsaber granting him superior leverage and strength, being able to mount offensive attacks that threaten to, shatter an enemy's bones, but at the same time building an impenetrable wall of defense is fascinating. So if I were a blade master in the Star Wars mythos, I would want to build upon Sarisu and Gemso. They're probably two of my favorite lightsaber forms, and I think that they surprisingly pair extremely well. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. To probably do something a little different, because, I'm pretty much in the same boat myself. I actually love the Makashi and Gemso pairing personally. I think that Vader's ability to not only hack down his opponents with overwhelming power, but also be able to place those power strikes in the most precise way was what took down his opponents quickly and effectively. I think that would be an absolutely deadly combo, and definitely one that I would go for. I'm kind of a bigger guy, so with my height, I would probably go for Gemso's power. But I also don't just go for brute strength, and I like a little elegance and movement, so Makashi would definitely be that one for me.
Yeah, you're really tall. How tall are you again?
I'm 6'7".
Oh my gosh. Dude, I've been telling people you were 6'5". You're 6'7"?
Yeah, I'm 6'7".
I never want to duel you. I give up. I concede. But
So
you are
it's
Darth
funny,
Vader's
actually,
height.
I am, yeah.
That's awesome.
I really want to cosplay Darth Vader because I'm his canonical height.
Yeah. If you put a helmet on, you're going to be 6'8".
Yeah, the helmet and shoes would make me 6'8".
6'8",
yeah.
6'9". My gosh.
Something like that. Yeah.
Dude, you have to do that. That would be so cool. Like an actual Darth Vader walking around.
It would be awesome, dude.
That's incredible.
That's why I want to get a replica of Balin's lightsaber because it's like a great saber with that longer hilt. I feel like that would be really comfortable for me to wield.
Yeah. No, that would look awesome. Also, you're way taller than Balin. Sorry.
Yeah, Ray Stevenson was 6'5".
He's 6'5"? Okay, that's taller than I thought. I thought Ray Stevenson was like 6'1", 6'2".
I looked him up. I think he's 6'5".
Wow. But that makes sense why you would want to, the cool thing about Vader and the cool thing with you too is it would be, you know so much and you're so precise with the Makashi and the Gemso pairing as well. So you have that overwhelming strength and the overwhelming domineering size, But Vader, he caught opponents off guard with just how much he knew and just how precise and elegant he was with the blade. So you can only imagine a Jedi's fear, walking up to someone like Vader, and then the realization that not only is he big, but he's also exceptionally advanced. And that's why, he's one of the best duelists ever, and why I think he would beat Yoda. But that's,
Oh no, we're gonna rehash that sometime very soon.
I had to bring it back to the, I guess, the almost midway point, more like within the first hour.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta take my boy Vader. I know you gotta take Yoda. But anyway, guys.
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bryce, for all the information and the research you put in. I hope if you guys have stuck around to this point, you've enjoyed this. We've tried to make the most comprehensive breakdown of the lightsaber forms on YouTube, and let us know if you guys agree. Let us know if we missed anything. And if you've stuck around this far, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. It means the world to both of us that you would give us all this time, and we love Star Wars so much, and we would love to chat more in the comments down below. And as the big question, I think it's pretty obvious, what lightsaber form would you guys want to use? It's always super, super fun to read what people decide what their forms would be and their reasoning behind that. And we invite you to do that down below. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to you, Bryce, for all the research and for coming on the channel today. Just
absolutely, it's always my pleasure to do this. And one of the things I want to know is, along with your lightsaber form, would you use Trickata? That's a big question.
I don't think I would. I think it's just too dangerous.
No,
it's foolhardy, but sometimes,
yeah,
high risk, high reward, like you put it. Anyway, guys,
all right.
Thank you so much. May the Force be with you always, and have a phenomenal day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.